Committee will come to order. Yesterday, we held our first briefing on the threats posed by the Chinese Communist Party. We reviewed the threats and actions our military should take to ensure success in any future conflict. Today, we are examining the state of the defense industrial base and how we can best position it to fully support our military if, in fact, the conflict breaks out. For over 200 years, we have relied on the skills of the men and women working in shipyards and factories throughout America to build the tools our warfighters need to succeed in battle. We cannot prevail in any conflict without a ready, strong, and adaptable industrial base. Yet the industrial base is experiencing a multitude of challenges. Some of these include inflation, workforce shortages, bureaucratic hurdles, and supply chains that remain too dependent on foreign sources for materials. Inflation continues to wreak havoc on the cost of materials, driving up the cost for suppliers and small manufacturers who are hemmed in by fixed-price contracts. Making matters worse, the administration refuses to use the authorities and resources Congress gave them last year to provide the necessary relief. Recruiting and retaining a skilled workforce was a problem before COVID, and it's only gotten worse. Bureaucratic contracting hurdles continue to slow things down and compound our ability to scale when needed. They also continue to present barriers for new entrants into the defense industrial base, which we need to advance innovation. We took steps to overcome some of these hurdles in last year's NDA, but I am confident that more must be done. Exacerbating these challenges is our important and necessary work to resupply Ukraine. That effort has laid bare many of our vulnerabilities, especially with respect to our ability to rapidly produce and field munitions. But the greatest concern I have with the defense industrial base is our continued reliance on China as the source of raw materials. The Chinese Communist Party maintains a tight grip on many of our material supply chains, including critical minerals and semiconductors. We will never prevail in a conflict with China if they're the source of our military supply. While we've made some progress in recent years, I won't stop until we've completely rid the defense supply chain of Chinese goods and materials. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about what resources and authorities are needed to help revitalize the defense industrial base and position it best to support our warfighters. And with that, I yield to my friend, the ranking member, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an incredibly important hearing. I want to thank our witnesses for being here. We've got an outstanding panel with considerable background in this issue. The industrial base, is a growing challenge, something that, as the chairman mentioned, we were certainly aware of before COVID and before the war in Ukraine. But those two issues have brought it into sharp focus. In both instances, we suddenly found ourselves in desperate need of a lot more of certain production items. And we looked around for how to create them and discovered that we did not have the surge capacity that we wanted, and we don't have the sustainable industrial base that we want to meet our needs in a variety of areas. But obviously in the Armed Services Committee, what we're focused on is meeting our needs in national security. And again, we have a huge challenge, and we're seeing that now play out in our effort to make sure we have enough munitions, basic ammunition, artillery, to meet the fighting requirements that are going on in Ukraine. And we've learned again that we don't quite have that surge capacity. I remember hearing a lot of people when we would talk about the need for this say, well, when the problem comes, we'll have surge capacity. That sounds great, okay? But we've come to find out it's really difficult to just sort of snap your fingers and all of a sudden create surge capacity. We have heard consistently from our industrial partners that they are not going to build a level of manufacturing capability necessary to produce stuff if they don't know that someone's going to buy it. This is what is, the cliche now has become, we need a demand signal, which basically means we need the government to promise us that they will pay us one way or another before we will make the investments to be able to make things quicker and faster. So we need to figure that out. What do we really need in the industrial base? We are not going to be able to prepare for every conceivable contingency. We just don't have the resources, and the private sector will not make that investment on a wish and a promise as to whether or not they will ever recoup that investment. So we need to be really strategic about it. What do we need? What are the most important things that we need to produce more of? And how do we do it? And we could not have three better people to help explain to us what those things are. And then the other issue is the one that the chairman mentioned directly, and that is our reliance on China. Starting roughly in the late 1990s into the early 2000s, China became the global corporate easy button. That's where you went to make stuff. Huge market, not much in the way of labor costs, certainly no environmental regulations. It was cheap, it was easy, it was the place to go. Now we are beginning to diversify, and in a bipartisan way. On this committee, in the Trump administration, in the Biden administration, a number of proposals have been made to stop our reliance on China and to begin to diversify that market. One key aspect of that is, yes, a lot of it will be done in the U.S. There's no way that the United States of America can meet this challenge on its own. And I know people don't like hearing that. We're America. We'll make everything here. We will be independent. That's not the way the global economy works. We need to increase our capacity, absolutely, but we also need to work with trusted partners. That's why things like the AUKUS agreement are so important. Who are those trusted partners? Yes, we would rather make it all here, but the thing that we really need is to make sure that it's not all made in China. So how do we find those partners in order to build up that capacity of them going forward? And the last point I will make is when we look at that industrial base, the real problem is, as the chairman mentioned, on innovation and on some of these smaller companies. And I have nothing against large prime contractors. They perform an incredibly important task for us. They have flexibility in a variety of different ways. There are so many capabilities on the smaller end that we are dependent upon small companies all across this country that don't have that flexibility. And when they disappear, we got nowhere to go. So I'm really curious to hear how we get those sort of smaller tier manufacturers going forward. And I guess I will make one other comment on precious earth minerals, rare earth and precious minerals. We really need to build the capacity to process those things. We can actually find them in a bunch of different places. It's the processing that is almost all done in China. What are we going to do to fix that? So I look forward to this hearing. I think it's an incredibly important topic. I thank the chairman for having it, and with that, I yield back.
I thank the ranking member, and I do hope the witnesses will pick up especially on that last point and help us understand how we can scratch that itch. I'd like to introduce our witnesses now. We have a very distinguished panel. The Honorable Eric Fanning is the current president and CEO of Aerospace Industries Association. He served as the 22nd Secretary of the Army and various other senior roles in his 25 years of government service. The Honorable David Norquist is the President and CEO of the National Defense Industrial Association. Mr. Norquist previously served as the 34th Deputy Secretary of Defense from 2019 to 21. And Matt Paxton is the President of the Shipbuilders Council of America, a role which he assumed in 2007 after a very distinguished career as a senior advisor in the Senate. There's not a lot of work to do over there, as they don't ever do anything. So what were you advising them on? Just joking. I welcome our witnesses, and we'll start with Mr. Fanning.
Good morning, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to discuss the state of the Defense Industrial Base. The Defense Industrial Base, the DIB, is the Department of Defense's most important partner in equipping and protecting our warfighters and defending our country. To fulfill this vital role, the companies that make up the DIB rely on clear demand signals from Congress, as well as sufficient federal investment, a regulatory environment that allows us to innovate and to move at the speed of relevance, and a healthy and resilient supply chain. Recently, a confluence of challenges, including a global pandemic, through which we never stopped working, record inflation, workforce challenges, and supply chain disruptions, to name a few, has put significant pressure on our industry. Simultaneously, demand is increasing due to a major ground war in Europe, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine almost 1 year ago, and the looming threat from China. All of this combined has many wondering about the health of the DIB. To best answer this question, it's crucial to understand our industry. The contours of the National Security Industrial Base and its ability to respond to these challenges are shaped by a single customer, the federal government. That is an important distinction from the commercial marketplace, and one that has an outsized impact on its products, people, and performance. Federal investments help ensure the overall health of the industry. That means that the number of programs prescribed by the Pentagon has a direct correlation to the shape of the industry. Competition within the industry ecosystem is driven by identifying something for which to compete. Companies react accordingly. A good example of programs with many competitors is UAVs. There are hundreds of programs and hence a multitude of competitors. And our industrial base is not monolithic. It is a diverse ecosystem with companies of all sizes, each with its own role to play. While small companies can be innovative incubators by virtue of their size and ability to speed decisions, prime contractors bring scalability, capability, and cash flow, as well as a large talent pool with extensive experience. Large primes can also afford to maintain a workforce in ready state to meet evolving needs. The condition of the industry today is not the result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but of successive decisions made over many years. Federal policy and investment in our national defense can be summed up in two words: unpredictable and inconsistent. Over the last 25 years, Congress has passed more than 120 continuing resolutions instead of on-time appropriations bills. In addition, we are still digging out from the effects of sequestration a decade ago. I saw some of these effects firsthand during my time at the Pentagon, but others have taken years to manifest and could take years to unwind without a sense of urgency. One result of these many years of successive decisions is an industrial base maximized to meet peacetime needs. This means excess capacity for surging is not always built into the system. We are optimized for efficiency. With the potential of conflict on the horizon, we must consider how we resource and support the capacity and resilience of the defense industrial base. Both Congress and DoD have a role to play. Sufficient funding comes first. This committee's leadership is evident in recent NDAAs. The growing bipartisan, bicameral support for increased funding in recent years has been an important signal to industry, but it's also critical that this funding is on time and predictable. Businesses need far more flexibility. The department must empower its workforce to move beyond a compliance culture to one that exercises existing flexibility. For example, contract flexibility to address sky-high inflation was a welcome step, but short-term in scope. Other key tools like progress payments ensure businesses have stable cash flow. And the cost of compliance for businesses has skyrocketed. How can we make it easier for businesses of all sizes to support national security? What existing regulations and policies are working as intended, and which are causing more harm than good? Taking additional steps to accelerate innovation and address harmful policies like R&D tax amortization will help the U.S. military meet the threats posed by a modernizing Chinese military. At the heart of everything is the workforce. We need policies and support to maintain this workforce, both skilled labor and degreed STEM workers. Every American should know they have a place in the aerospace and defense industry. Several top Pentagon leaders acknowledge that the department doesn't make it easy to do business with them. Even the Pentagon's reports on competition in small business largely highlight the barriers faced by companies wanting to be a part of our nation's security. Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee, we are grateful for the time you have taken to visit our members and hear from us firsthand. I extend an invitation to anyone here or at the Pentagon to do the same. Industry is a partner, not an adversary. Let's work together to meet the moment. I've included a number of recommendations in my written testimony. On behalf of the Aerospace Industries Association, I want to again thank the committee for prioritizing this critical issue, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Fanning. Mr. Norquist, you're recognized.
Thank you. Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today on the state of the defense industrial base and its essential role in national security. I will limit myself to brief opening remarks and, with the Chair's permission, submit for the record NDIA's Vital Sign 2023 report. For over 100 years, the National Defense Industrial Association has worked to improve collaboration between industry and government so our nation's security can fully harness the benefits of our innovative industrial base. As a trade association, NDI represents over 1,800 defense companies of all sizes and all sectors, and the majority of our members are small businesses. The defense industrial base is critical to our national security. Its people develop, produce, maintain, and repair the platforms, equipment, supplies, and advanced technologies our warfighters need. They are the welders, engineers, programmers, scientists, analysts, and technicians who respond to our nation's call to maintain our military and to build the future force. Today, there is a mismatch between what our national strategies aim to achieve and how our defense industrial base is postured. Both the 2018 and the 2022 National Defense Strategies highlight the return of great power competition. And the 2022 National Security Strategy states, quote, "The post-Cold War era is definitely over, and a competition is underway between the major powers to shape what comes next." However, key industrial readiness indicators for great power competition are going in the wrong direction. For example, we should expect the number of workers in the defense industrial base to be increasing. In 1985, the U.S. had 3 million workers in the defense industry. In 2021, there were 1.1 million workers in the sector, and that number is remaining flat. We should expect the number of companies in the defense industrial base to be increasing, but analysis shows that over the last 5 years, a net 17,000 companies have left the defense industrial base. In particular, the Department of Defense recently estimated the number of small businesses participating in the defense industrial base has declined over 40% in the last decade. From 1985 to 2021, funding for national defense decreased from 5.8 to 3.2% of U.S. GDP, and the Congressional Budget Office projects a further decline to 2.7% by 2032. In addition, in 13 of the last 14 years, we have had long continuing resolutions that specifically prevent new starts or increased production rates. These trends are not consistent with creating the defense industrial base required for great power competition. But the current state of the defense industrial base is not an accident. It developed in response to government policy and funding. To produce resilience in the defense industrial base, the government must value it in budgeting and in its contracting processes. This would include encouraging vendors to use multiple suppliers, having more parts in stock, and building surge capacity. This can be done through contracts, as well as supported by Congress via multi-year authority and advanced procurement. We should also make it easier for firms to do business with the government, particularly small businesses and those non-traditional industries who cannot afford the many regulatory barriers to entry, the long contracting timelines, and the disruptive uncertainty with annual appropriations. The return of great power competition places greater demands on America's defense industrial base. A brittle industrial base is a strategic vulnerability. A resilient defense industrial base is a powerful deterrent. I appreciate the committee's wisdom in prioritizing this critical issue. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Norquist. Mr. Paxton.
Yes, thank you. And on behalf of the Shipbuilders Council of America, I'd like to thank Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the House Armed Services Committee for the opportunity to provide the shipyard industrial perspective on the state of the industrial base. The U.S. shipyard industry is a diverse and critical manufacturing sector of our nation's economy. A recent study by the Maritime Administration found that the industry supports nearly 400,000 direct and indirect jobs, touching all 50 states, and contributes $42.2 billion annually to GDP. Shipyards are engaged in building, maintaining, modernizing, and repairing vessels of all sizes for the U.S. Navy, Coast Guard, Army, NOAA, the Maritime Administration, local and state governments, and the 40,000 commercial vessels that operate in domestic commerce. Additionally, there's a vast supplier base that provides goods and services that support all facets of domestic shipbuilding and ship repair. Our shipyard manufacturing sector is truly a national asset and one that is not immune to the many recent historic challenges that adversely impacted global supply chains, access to critical markets, materials, COVID impacts on the workforce, record inflation, and a fundamentally changing marketplace. In spite of these challenges, U.S. shipyard industry showed its capacity to implement rapid protocols to keep the workforce safe while navigating an ever-evolving global pandemic. As a designated critical infrastructure industry, your American shipyards never shut down. And shipyard employees cut steel to build, repair, maintain, and modernize our ships throughout the pandemic. Indeed, in the height of the pandemic in 2020, the shipyard industry delivered 10 ships to the Navy and maintained and modernized many more. I believe this is a testament to the culture of safety found in our shipyards that predated the pandemic. Unfortunately, over the last several years, industry has also experienced unpredictable budgets, a volatile acquisition environment with repeated shifts in fleet size and mix that make CapEx and facility investment decisions more difficult. Moreover, once the people are lost as production lines are stopped and started, they're more difficult to replace. The most effective mechanism to ensure the industrial base is stable and resilient is through a consistent upward and adequately funded demand signal. Let me state up front, the shipyard industrial base has made and will continue to make considerable investments in its workforce to hire and train the next generation of skilled craftsmen and women. In addition, the private shipyard industry has made substantial investments in new capital infrastructure, including dry docks, to meet the demands of the Navy's new construction and ship repair plans. Private shipyards require a predictable workload and a volume of work to support recapitalization of equipment, to keep rates low, and to train and retain a sustainable workforce. In addition to funding the construction of Navy vessels, there must be a similar commitment to fund the tail, the maintenance of the current ships entering the fleet to ensure they reach their expected service lives. Much like shipbuilding, ship repair and modernization would benefit from the use of acquisition strategies that promote private sector investment in people and infrastructure, increases the volume of work in existing private shipyards, and promotes the speed of execution to meet the unique challenges of the maintenance and modernization environments. It is not possible to get to the legally mandated 355 fleet size if the services do not adequately budget to maintain the ships that we do have and that are being commissioned over the next few years for the duration of their service lives. SCA applauds the work of this committee in the FY23 NDAA to prevent the decommissioning of 24 additional ships and to restore some predictability to maintenance schedules. Regardless of this assessment, the private shipyard industry and the associated critical supply chain remain committed partners in building, maintaining, and modernizing the most capable and advanced Navy for the nation and our dedicated servicemen and women. Thank you again for the opportunity to provide the shipyard industry perspectives on the state of the industrial base, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Paxton. Thank all the witnesses. I now recognize myself for questions. Mr. Norquist, you mentioned in your statement the number of companies that have left the industrial base, and I'm particularly concerned about those who focus on munitions and rocket motor providers. How do we bring those people back in or make it inviting for these kind of companies, particularly small companies, to participate in the industrial base?
So when you look at how particularly the smaller companies operate, they have a much lower ability to tolerate gaps between when there's a requirement and their ability to deliver. So things that shorten those timelines so they can ramp up and have expectations. One of the things the committee did recently that's very helpful is multi-year contracts, right? If you're a business and you're going to ramp up and increase the size of your facility and you're going to hire people, you want to be able to promise those people not you have a job until the next appropriation and authorization bill is enacted, and then we'll see, but we've got it for 4 years and we can invest in the facility. So that level of predictability and when that can be provided is a huge help. The other thing to look at is the number of times we introduce a rule or regulation on government contractors that are not common in the private sector. This is most disruptive to a firm that has 1 foot in each and starts getting frustrated with all the additional requirements. Many of them well-intentioned, many of them important, but when you look at the cumulative effect, that firm decides it's easier to move out. The most recent example, and it's a side effect of our business, is inflation. When the inflation hit and small businesses in the private sector could change their prices tomorrow, woman-owned small business I was talking to, they're locked into their salaries for 5 years with the government, so she's going to watch her staff leave. So those are a couple of examples, sir.
Great. Mr. Fanning, you heard the ranking member mention this concern about China's control of minerals and many materials that we need in our supply chain. Does that worry you? And if so, what do you recommend that we do about that concern?
It does worry me, Mr. Chairman, and it worries the members as well. I'd point out that it took us years to get to where we are, built on different policies with China, and as we pivot and try and extricate ourselves, particularly on the national security side, it's going to take time, shared effort, and a sense of urgency. We largely source from friends anyhow, as is right now. Our largest exporters in the defense world are our largest importers as well. China, Canada, Japan, Canada, the UK, Germany, and France. So it's really just down to those minerals, but that's still a concern of ours. And as the ranking member pointed out, a big part of that is processing. We know where to get the minerals, but the processing of it is a difficult, expensive process that has
Why?
environmental impact.
And what could we do to make it easier?
Well, I think
less
this is one of my suggestions would be that we change the name of the office in the Pentagon and Defense Industrial Policy to something else, because that has negative connotations. And I think when you look at it from the lens of national security, there is an important aspect for us to work together, government and industry, and figure out what each needs to do. In this particular case, I think investment on the part of government to get that started, to get that market, that capability started, so that the industry side then has a source and can turn to it and support it would be critically important, because we've lost that capability.
Mr. Paxton, why is it important to receive more consistent demand signal from the Navy regarding its shipbuilding and repair plans?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think most people understand in this room that shipyards and ship repair facilities are highly intensive capital enterprises. So a lot of long-term investments are made in our shipyards and our facilities, but also a lot of our shipyards employ thousands and thousands of employees. So there's a dedicated aspect of investing in our workforce as well. Look, if we get a new shipbuilding plan every year for 11 years, it sends a confusing message to industry. So to the extent that we can have stable budgets, we got through sequestration and the Budget Control Act, to the extent that we can have stable budgets and a stable demand signal, I know this has come up a few times this morning, industry will respond accordingly. They have in the past. So I think industry makes those investments, and they want that stable market in front of them. Lastly, I'll say, and this committee has done this, acquisition strategies like incremental funding, advanced procurement, block buy contracting, those are huge for shipyards, because that gives it the long lead time materials that we need to sequence ships, to have that stuff come in, whereas some of the materials we were buying, it was only 18 months to get, now it's 2 to 3 years to get. So it's really critical, sir. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. The chair now yields to Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for scheduling this important hearing right at the outset of this Congress, which I think sends a strong message that, as an article that I wrote for The Hill, the title was, "It's the Defense Industrial Base, Stupid." And again, I think it's really something we have to keep reminding ourselves. It's how we won World War II, when you really drill down in terms of the overwhelming force that our industrial base was able to bring to the battle. I come from a district which, going back to the Obama administration, has the #1 priority of acquisition priority in terms of recapitalizing our undersea nuclear deterrent. The Columbia program had just laid the keel for the first of 12 ships that are going to basically built through the late 2030s. And it is an all-hands-on-deck situation right now in terms of both workforce, supply chain, and facility. The omnibus that we just passed and the President signed on December 29th included $768 million for those 3 critical items that are necessary for this program to succeed. And the FIT-UP, which came over with the 23 budget, actually proposes another $1.6 billion of investment, again, in workforce, supply chain, and facility. So Matt, you've been around this business a long time. I mean, what, in terms of the demand signal and the investment signal that the Navy has put into that program, what's your take on it, and is that the approach that really we need to sort of size up for other parts, not just of the Navy's budget, but frankly other service branches?
Programs. The answer is yes, sir. Your work on House Education and Labor in this committee, I think, led to a lot of those type of thoughtful, considerations on investment. I will say this, sir, the private shipyard industry every day of the week is investing in their workforce. So they have training facilities, apprenticeship programs, they team with local, community colleges. So investments like this from the federal level kind of, get bang for the buck for what the private industry is doing as well. So I really do believe, while we care deeply about the submarine industrial base, the fact that some of these monies are going to go across other shipbuilding programs is absolutely critical. And it's also critical for our supply chain, trying to build that out as well. So these investments are
Great.
right.
Thank you. And again, I would emphasize This funding is not just going to southeastern Connecticut. This is going all across the country because the supply chain necessary for Columbia is critical. We just had a new contract signed in Alabama with Austal that will become a major supplier into that program. And again, just to follow up your point, we've been working on this for a number of years, and in fact, the Department of Education Career and Technical Education funding, which funds the tech schools, the Department of Labor's funding for pre-apprenticeship training through the Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act and the National Apprenticeship Act, that has really been the pathway that we've gone from 7,000 workers to 19,500. And so, again, it really, if we're going to get serious about really expanding the workforce of the industrial base, it has to be an all-of-government endeavor that includes the departments that have really been in this space for a long time. And again, I would appreciate your thoughts on that.
And Congressman Courtney, as you know, in the shipbuilding and ship repair industry, we're heavily regionalized. So we don't have necessarily best practices throughout. We don't have an accreditation necessarily across the nation. So when you have that regionalization and workforce development and those processes, to have a federal agency kind of bringing in best practices, I think is a smart move. And I think the industry, single biggest issue facing the industry is people. And that's going to be the case going forward. And we got to be more creative in our workforce development. So I think initiatives like this are hitting the spot.
Thank you. Again, if you go back to the World War II example, in 1937, Congress passed the Fitzgerald Act, which created the National Apprenticeship Program, which set a national standard for the trades, whether it's welding, electricians, sheet metal, shipwrights, you name it. And that created sort of a baseline of quality in terms of the workforce that, again, fast forward just even a few years after that law was signed, it was critical in terms of making sure that the ability of our industrial base to meet the moment and build the ships, planes, ground vehicles, et cetera, was actually able to succeed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Minister Wilson from South Carolina.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and again, congratulations on your chairmanship, and we're really appreciative. Secretary Fanning, supporting allies and partners through foreign military sales is a function only secured by the Department of Defense acquisition system, which standard contract takes an average of 18 months to award. As tensions with China grow, the aggression by war criminal Putin into Ukraine, and the threats to Israel are ever made by Iran, what can the Department of Defense do to improve the overall foreign military sales process to deliver the best capability to partners in an accelerated time, especially for those in a current conflict, to try to achieve peace through strength?
I think there are many things. First of all, this will be a reoccurring theme today, I'm sure. We're poised for peace. Our sense of urgency, our processes, how we invest, and we've got to move dramatically away from that to a sense of urgency, and the FMS system is certainly a part of that. And it's only going to get worse. The weapon sales we talked about to Poland, when we transition from giving things to Ukraine to selling things from Ukraine, it's going to grind down to a very slow process when it goes to the foreign military sales system. So I think there are a number of things we have to do. We have to streamline the process. We have to change the presumption that's built into the process from the start to the finish. And it's really going to take dedicated senior leader attention to make sure this moves through the process.
And we need your industries to really be prepared. An unintended positive is that our allies in NATO, who were formerly of the Warsaw Pact, it's a wonderful opportunity for them to divest themselves of Soviet-era equipment, but immediately backfill for the defense of their countries with defensive capabilities. And so not only threats, but we have opportunities. And so I wish you well on that. And Secretary Norquist, the defense industrial base under current policies and financial investments are not currently oriented to support a defense ecosystem built for peer adversarial conflict. There's a mismatch between what our national strategies are and our defense industrial base as postured. And with the return of the great power competition, this gap is an unsustainable indictment. With that, what can we do for the United States to lean forward on the critical issue? What can the U.S. defense industrial base do to increase outputs at a normal supply, regularly scheduled demands, while also rapidly fulfilling a surge and reconstituting military demands required for the potential of peer and near-peer conflict?
So I think one of the first things, and I know this committee has mentioned this department, is to look at the consumption rates and the expectations of the inventory we need in a high-end conflict. The quantities you need if you're only expecting low-end conflicts or regional conflict are modest. You can replace them. But what we're seeing in the Ukraine is the volume of artillery, the volume of other munitions being consumed, and you need to start building stockpiles and quantities to meet that. The second thing is when you look at contracts, are you pricing it to get exactly a certain number and no more, or are you building in resilience, additional capacity, additional throughput, spare parts in line so that there's not disruption? Both of those could go a long way to making it much stronger.
And in addition, we're also pleased that we have had a significant prepositioning in Europe.
Correct.
And maintained it through the post-Cold War period. And a concern so many constituents have, are we depleting too quickly? But we do have extraordinary capabilities that are already in place, and particularly for delivery to the extraordinarily brave people of Ukraine. Mr. Paxton, your written statement describes the Navy as having provided mixed messages over the last 5 years. What specificity and clarity does the Shipbuilders Council of America need for the United States Navy to ensure that the industry can accomplish the 355 ship objective?
Well, I think it begins with stable budgets, and I think the shipyard industry would tell you, the private industry would tell you, that 10-year horizon. What is the plan over this 10-year period? We know the 30-year shipbuilding plan is going to not be fully in line with what's going to happen, but that 10-year horizon allows shipyards, again, to make critical investments in its facilities and its workforce. I think we've benefited from concepts where we split various ship sizes across shipyards. I think there's goodness in trying to get series construction going, keep hot production lines going, and keep the workforce learning. I think those are things that will help. And we're also there to meet, as partners with the Navy on, new technologies and new ship classes. We're part of the team.
Gentleman's time
Thank you.
expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for each of the witnesses, thank you. I'm going to take this in a slightly different way, probably because for the last 4 years, I've been looking at readiness, otherwise known as, are we ready? The bottom line of it is that we spend an awful lot of time and energy in this committee and to buy bright, new, shiny things, all of which are extraordinarily expensive, and we don't spend much time thinking about maintaining them. So this is my own little particular area of concern is I would like us as a committee here, as the authorizers of the purchase of bright, new, shiny things, that we require that we always, together with the new, plan for the maintenance as they grow older. F-35, rather good example of, 15 years now we've been working on that, and now we're finally thinking about a depot repair depot in Florida. Gee. Ships, Matt, we can talk about that. Yeah, we have a 20-year PSYOP program for the public yards, which is absolute baloney, not worth anything. You give me a 1-year and a 5-year plan and you have my attention. I think somebody mentioned 10 years. No. What are you going to do in the next 5 years? And how are you going to get and then beyond that? I suppose I'm just going to yield back. I'm just going to express my frustration at the defense industrial base, but mostly at us, for not paying attention to the ongoing maintenance and requirements that have to be built into it. And so we find ourselves with ships. Maybe we can keep 50% of them at sea. Oh, we're going to have 350 ships? Really? And we can't even keep half of them at sea? F-35s. We go on and on and on here. So I'm going to just give you a heads up, folks. I would think the new chairman of the Readiness Committee will follow along with similar concerns that I have about being prepared, maintenance. We can take a look at Ukraine, and whatever we send there is going to have to be maintained. They're doing a pretty good job, actually. I'm going to yield back and let somebody else go. I've been banging this drum and enough said here, but we've got to maintain. Oh, did I mention O&M? For us, for this committee, and for the appropriators, heads up on O&M. That's everything that needs to be done for readiness, and we rip it off every year. If we're not ripping it off, the appropriators are, and if the appropriators aren't ripping it off, the military Department of Defense is doing it. I'll let it go at that. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Paxton, I'd like to discuss the Navy's submarine industrial base with you. As you know, the plan is to produce 1 Columbia-class and 2 Virginia-class submarines per year at Electric Boat and Newport News. The Columbia program has very little, if any, margin for error, as it needs to start coming online in October 2030 to replace the current Ohio-class submarines that will begin retiring in fiscal year 2027. This is a massive task for our shipbuilders. A recent GAO report found that after more than a year of full-scale construction on the first Columbia, shipbuilders are facing delays because of challenges with design, materials, and quality. The GAO report also questioned the plan to add staff to Columbia from Virginia, since they assess there is not sufficient long-term planning for shared risks between the programs. Can you share your views on this challenge with the committee, specifically the workforce and material availability issues that are already plaguing this no-fail program?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. Tough question. I will say that.
And could you put the microphone
Yes,
closer
sorry.
to you?
Sorry, Congressman. Yeah, I will say that, unfortunately, as a representative of the Trade Association, I don't have a lot of visibility into the specific programs. That would probably be more of a question for the vendor to kind of dig into some of those really technical issues, probably some classified issues as well. I will say that the industry is certainly up for the challenge. We are hiring rapidly. I know Electric Boat has been one of the top hires in that area for that program. But as for the specifics of what's going on there, sir, I apologize. I don't think I can really get into much granular, detail.
Okay, well, we'll certainly be pursuing that with some of the other folks you mentioned in the near future. And Mr. Fanning, I have more of a general question for you. The last time we met, we had a great discussion about the need to build and expand the defense industrial base workforce and talent pipeline. It's always a challenge, and there's a challenge sometimes because industry has different pay scales, maybe than government service. How can the defense industry better recruit and retain workers, and how do we deconflict these efforts between government and industry to ensure adequate staffing?
Thank you for that question. Workforce is the single most important issue for our industry and many other industries, I'm sure. And that was before COVID, before inflation, before the surge that we're going through right now. I think there are a number of things that we could do in the near term. It's harder for our industry in a number of ways. One, we can't work from home in most of the jobs. Two, a number of them are cleared. The security clearance process, and I've been talking about this, or I've been a part of conversations for 30 years since I used to work on the HASC staff on this issue. But we've got to do something about that because it's increasingly difficult to get a workforce on the national security side. Also with inflation, not just with technological development on the commercial side over time, but with inflation, there's a growing divide between what we can pay on the defense side and what they can pay on the commercial side. The Department of Defense requires some pretty strict definitions, requirements for the workforce that don't necessarily align with what we think we need and what we can hire from the outside. So there's no single silver bullet for this, and in fact, I think if we don't get at it for the country as a whole, we're going to continue to have problems in the defense industrial base.
Well, we're going to certainly need the help of all of the people in your association. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Norquist, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and to you for holding this hearing. And we are only scratching the surface on this issue. It is complex. It's what we've been doing for years. Mr. Whitman and I have traveled extensively, and it's not unique to this country about the industrial base, and in particular, the workforce. We are timing out of those who have grown up with the idea of working with your hands was noble. We all understand that the narrative that's going on, and I hear it every day in labor and education, is you got to go to college in order to make it in America. And that somehow if you work with your hands, you are less than. Well, the first thing we can do as a nation is give credit to those who want to work with their hands and their head. But parents, guidance counselors, teachers, from very early age are telling them college is the way to go. And that's true for some, but certainly not for all. We have the ability to change that. Our industrial base, I hear about the signals and the budgeting, couldn't agree more. We had an opportunity and had it for 4 years trying to change the Buy American provisions. We can't buy it all ourselves. We need those trusted partners. But we can incrementally build it back to where it was. We have offshored so much of our supply base over years. It's not a 1 or 2 year. If we had followed this, and we'll have another opportunity this year, it sends your demand signals that you're asking for. We don't have to get to 100, but we have to build from that. So my question to each of you very simply is, in your view, what role does government have versus the commercial industry in managing the risk that we are talking about? We have come from a just-in-time supply base, which means you don't have anything sitting on the shelf, to right now, we're hearing the other end of it, where we can't get it because it's not just in time. Whose responsibility and where does that line go? So, Mr. Chairman, if we could start with you.
Thanks for that question. I think, as I said in my opening statement, the defense industrial base has a single customer and responds to that customer. And I think there are, Secretary Norquist said 2 things. We can stockpile, we can build surge capacity, and there's a third thing we can do that we're doing, which is industry and the Pentagon working together to identify when we mobilize, what is it that we need to surge? Because as Ranking Member Smith said, we can't, across everything we buy, stockpile and build in surge capacity. So if it doesn't meet the level of wanting to stockpile or paying the extra to build surge capacity in, we can break down what those items are that we need when we mobilize, when we surge, figure out what are the long lead issues in there. Is it workforce? Is it materials? Is it parts? Is it tooling? And make sure that we have those elements ready.
So the explosives and the accelerants, 4 years ago, we started changing that. If you go to any of these plants around our country, it's a rollback to World War I and World War II, literally. So the GOCOs address that issue, but who ultimately bears that responsibility? Ms. Norquist, you've been in the middle of this.
Sure. So I think when you look at quality, personnel, and so forth, those are the responsibility of the company. But many of the topics you raise are strategic risks, and it gets back to the thing that Ranking Member Smith made, which is you can't cover everything. So what is it that is the highest risk? Is it based on models and wargaming, is it munitions that you're afraid of running out of? Is it certain platforms? Is it the supply range? You have to model that to be able to decide where are you prioritizing the investments? Where are you going to pay to have a GOCO because you want that extra modern facilitization? Or where is it that's worth having surge capacity? That's so closely tied, and that's the reason we're talking about this, which is because we pivoted to a high-end fight, all of those risk calculations are changing. Before we modeled it based on the types of threats we had. We're now facing a different one. That's why I think that's essential to the government to say, these are the risks we want to pay and to reduce, and this is how we intend to do it. And that's, I think, where the combination comes together.
Thank you. And our last 30 seconds, you.
I was just going to say, on some of the surge capacity that we see, the government buying large infrastructure, be it a dry dock, there's language in the FY23 NDAA that said, hey, let's look at the best case analysis for what you're going to do with that dry dock. So we support surge. We understand that it's a necessary aspect for the Navy, but we just don't want to be in competition with those assets.
I yield back. Thank you.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us. Let me begin by saying how concerned I am about the messaging coming out of the Pentagon, especially this past year, where they made some comments about the industrial base. The Department of the Navy said that they do not believe the industrial base can deliver the 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers that were authorized and funded this past year. To me, that's deeply concerning. I want to get some perspective from all of you all about the foundational aspects of our industrial base. I believe that the industrial base is given clear objectives, understanding what the procurement process is going to involve in the long term, that they will be able to invest in their workforce, be able to invest in infrastructure, be able to make the investments necessary to scale to consistent production over the years. And I want to begin with Mr. Paxton. Can you give me your perspective about how inconsistent and wavering procurement objectives from the Pentagon affect the industry's ability to be able to do the long-term construction elements of our defense budget that it's called upon to do? And especially, too, when the Pentagon speaks out of both sides of their mouth, says, well, we need all these ships, or we need all these aircraft, or we need all these platforms, yet we don't believe the industrial base can deliver, and then also provide inconsistent objectives in procurement.
Yeah. Well, thank you for this committee and the work they did on delivering those ships in the budget. I will say this. The question of capacity comes up often. And if you took a poll of the private shipbuilding industry and ship repair industry, they would tell you we have underutilized assets. We have not utilized assets at all. So I think there is capacity in the shipyard industrial base across new shipbuilding and ship repair. And I do think in relations to whatever the demand signal coming from Congress, we're going to meet it. We're going to meet it because we're going to sequence our yards to be more productive. We're going to train up the workforce, and we're going to deliver those assets. So I think private industry fundamentally disagrees with the assertion we don't have the capacity.
Gotcha. Mr. Norquist?
So I would say that think about what the signal is, right? If the requirement is 3, and you say, I don't think the industry can do it, we'll do 2, then you've signaled to the industry, do 2. You've sort of given yourself the self-fulfilling answer. And we run into that a lot when either the administration makes a request, or vice versa, and you've signaled to the industry, regardless of what you're hearing somebody say they need, you're only going to get 2 because you can only produce 2. Well, the thing that limits them most of all is not having a contract for the third. You know, it doesn't have to be a ship, it can be a plane, whatever it is. But when you sign the contract, they immediately know, I need to increase production. And when they see that there's more coming, they realize, I'm going to start having a backlog if I don't expand. So I am more concerned with being clear about what the nation's requirement is, and we need X number, and then going to industry and say, now deliver. And when they can see those showing up in contracts, they can then safely make the investments to increase capacity. But sometimes we end up signaling the exact opposite of what we intend.
Mr. Fanning?
I'd add consistency as an element here. I spent far more years of my life in the Pentagon than I have with industry, and I'm shocked at what I didn't know at the time. And one of those things is consistency. One of our members, who's a shipbuilder, talks about the Navy slash chart, where, you know, at the end of the year, as they're doing the budget, the number of whatever they're going to build is 3, then it's 2, then it's 3. It's in industry's interest to meet the needs of its customer. It just needs that clear signal and a consistent signal so there's trust and belief on the industry side.
Gotcha. Mr. Paxton, if the Pentagon does deliver clear budget and procurement objectives, give me a sense about what that means to the industry in simple things like developing workforce, doing long lead time material purchases, making the investments in the yard so that capacity is there to make sure that the industry is able to deliver.
Yes, sir. I will say that's going on as we speak. Even with those slash budgets, those inconsistent numbers, our yards went out and spent, you know, billions in updating our facilities so we can meet this demand. Fully anticipating that, you know, numbers have been inconsistent. We've done that. So not giving you too much more other than the fact that the industry is making those investments as we speak, sir. And last thing I'll say, recruitment of workforce, you can look around the nation. It's thousands and thousands in different places where shipyards are having hiring days.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Chair, now recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Van, thank you for your testimony. In your written remarks, you recommend that federal hiring practices for contractors shift from a degree requirement to a skills-first hiring practice. This is an area that I'm very interested in across all federal agencies. Can you elaborate on the hiring changes you have seen in the commercial aerospace industry? And could you also share any results that those hiring changes have produced and where the defense aerospace industry could benefit from adopting these changes?
Well, first, thank you for the question. First, I'd say the industrial base is shared. The supply chain is shared. That's something we saw very acutely during COVID, and it can shape what companies do, how much work they want to do on the defense side or the non-defense side, and workforce is a part of that. There's much more flexibility on the non-defense side for companies to hire workers with certain types of skills that they can train, skill up into something else, or without skills that they can do. And it goes back to Congressman Courtney's question earlier about, Mr. Norquist maybe, about apprenticeships versus college degrees. This gets baked into the input part of the contract and really limits the defense companies who are already struggling to build the workforce all up and down, particularly at the smaller company level. So I think trying to free that up a little bit and recognize a little bit more that the workforce has changed, the future of work has changed, how we train and educate that workforce has changed. We need it at all different levels in the defense and aerospace industry. Workers that come out of apprenticeship programs, those that have higher education degrees, very skilled workers. And one thing I'd say about apprenticeship programs too is it helps with retention. A shipbuilder yesterday say that they have much higher retention with workers that come through an apprentice program and have the training and the understanding of what they're getting into than those who walk off the street.
Thank you for being here. I'm proud that my district in Phoenix is home to semiconductor and microelectronics research, development, and manufacturing. These technologies are essential to every electronic device and are crucial to our country's ability to maintain a competitive edge over our foreign adversaries. And thanks to CHIPS and the Science Act signed into law last year, we'll only continue to boost our nation's semiconductor sector, providing good jobs and helping to combat our reliance on China. Can you speak to the importance of the semiconductor supply chain and domestic investments for the defense industrial base?
So the microchip supply chain is absolutely essential for several reasons. First of all, with modern technology, those chips are in a wide range, not just of the systems that we field, but in the systems that build the things that we field. And so when you see a disruption, you can have a disruption both of the final product and a delay and everything before it. But you also have a second challenge, which is even more than most other things, microchips have the risk of tamper, and you've got to be certain of the reliability of your supply chain, the reliability of the items. This is why it was so important when Congress passed the CHIPS Act and said this is one place that is worth us protecting our supply chain, producing the reliability. Now, defense is actually only a small consumer of those, but it is an essential part of the same risks and challenges that defense faces as well.
Excellent. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. Desjardins.
Thank you. And this is for all of you, and we've covered some of this, but we'll just delve into it further. In my discussions with the industry, the biggest obstacle to meeting our production goals seems to be workforce. We are seeing some encouraging signs, however, including data from the Bureau of Labor and statistics indicating that more graduates are choosing STEM degrees than were a decade ago. Are these encouraging signs being seen on your end as well? And is the demand outpacing these growing graduates?
I'll go first. Thank you for that question. There are encouraging signs, but it's a big hole we're trying to dig out of, and it's compounded now by inflation. I think particularly on the defense side when there are contracts without adjustments, because on the non-defense side, particularly companies that are involved in both, they can just move their work and their efforts and their sales over to that side and change their rates. And on the defense side. So there are encouraging signs, but I think we still have a long way to go, and I suspect it's going to be a problem we're focused on for the duration of our lifetimes.
So when we surveyed our membership, 82% said it was difficult, somewhat very difficult to get STEM, which is even higher than their concern over clearances, which shows you the demand and the market competition there. Part of it was losing out to private sector firms who, when there's a shortage, they raise the rates. And also that according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the demand for STEM positions is going to go up twice as fast as the average. So this is one where there is a nationwide demand signal, and our players, our membership is competing in that market, but they do find it very difficult.
Yeah, I would just say that our shipyards participate in STEM scholarship programs. They go out to local technical schools and community colleges and work with them on that. So we see the need and the demand, and we're working on it.
Okay. And also, what are you doing to retain some of the graybeard, older population in the workforce as we reopen these production lines and relearn how to fight an industrial war for the first time in decades? I would think it becomes only more vital to retain some of the institutional knowledge. So in addition to the recruitment efforts you're all undertaking with the STEM grads, what retention efforts are you using to maintain the industrial knowledge during this critical moment?
In some industries in particular, that is a focus, maintaining, especially as we've lost some of that apprenticeship capability in the country, maintaining some of that experienced workforce. It was made harder during COVID when we had a number of people who just decided to leave early and retire early, but companies are doing what they can to try and increase retention with packages, with bonuses, what have you, to maintain that skill set as we start to surge.
I'll just add, I'm constantly hearing from companies and small businesses in my district about the issue of wage inflation, and I know oftentimes the defense contractors operate on fixed price contracts where there's very little opportunity to pass costs on to the government. As we gradually say economic price adjustment clause is no longer being included into defense contracts, I'm curious to know how you all are dealing with these increasing labor costs and retaining your workforce.
So as you point out, the absence of those economic cost adjustments in existing contracts is a real challenge, because often the government will award a 5-year contract, and when there wasn't much inflation, the out years went up 2% a year. So small businesses I've talked to, their labor rates are now locked for 4 years, and they know that they can't keep those employees, after we've had 9% inflation, at 2% raises going forward. So, part of their challenge is in new contracts, they can get awarded at the new rate, or new ones if the government includes economic cost adjustments, but those old ones really put them in a bind and their risk of losing their workforce. So that's one of the challenges, particularly small businesses are facing in this environment.
Okay. And I also understand that a previous barrier to hiring was the security clearance process. As the backlog for security clearances continues to shrink, are you finding that this barrier has become less pronounced, or are there still other barriers like cost of or finding qualified applicants that are hindering you all?
So first of all, there are other barriers, but I would like to flag this because there's a lot of things this hearing we're talking about that are challenges. The timeline for top secret clearance went from 452 days to 120, and from secret from 244 to 81. Now, you still have to have a clearance, which is a harder part than a commercial, but that was an area where there's tremendous focus by this committee and the government, and there's been progress. And when we survey our membership, that shows up. So it's an obstacle, it's a challenge versus jobs that don't require it, but it is significantly better than it has been in the past. And it shows that when the industry and the government focuses on something, we can really help move it.
Okay, thank you all. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New Jersey, Ms. Sherrill, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. As many of you know, nearly 3 years ago, this committee put together a task force focused on defense critical supply chain issues. And Secretary Fanning, thank you so much for your help on that. It's good to see you again. One of the recommendations of that task force, which was included in the FY 2021 NDAA, was a requirement that the department create a plan to reduce reliance on critical materials sourced from adversarial nations, and that was nearly, again, 3 years ago. So last month, I received a briefing at Picatinny Arsenal. It was really clear how important their work on the supply chain is, and with their hands-on understanding of the munitions development, supply, and logistics, their expertise is tremendous, and really they are key partners, I think, in leading this. However, while we saw some good signs, antimony, for example, I'm incredibly concerned that we aren't making progress fast enough. So Secretary Fanning, Secretary Norquist, Congress has shown itself to be willing to take action on the issues related to workforce in our supply chain. I know our chair has workforce issues front and center. Mr. Courtney had a great op-ed on that. I know Mr. Norquist, my chair last year in the Tactical Air and Land Subcommittee, has been laser focused on GOCOs and COCOs, but we're just not moving fast enough in these areas, and especially when it comes to some of those critical materials that we are tracking to sources that are really concerning. What other authorities and resources do the department and industry need to really make serious headway there?
Well, thank you. This is obviously a very critical issue, and I appreciate your attention on it. Part of the difficulty is we found ourselves where we were relying on China for those minerals over many years, giving up our capacity and our ability to do that for many reasons, as has been pointed out: the expense, the environmental impact of the processing of these materials. So there isn't that capability, and there isn't necessarily a market for that capability to grow organically on its own. So one of the important aspects is investment, government investment, to get that market going, to create that domestically or among our friend sharing, among our allies, in order to create that for our companies in the industrial base as a supplier. And so I think it's a sense of urgency on the part of all of those that are involved. You clearly, this committee has shown that, but now it's an issue for the federal government to help create that market, which is not easy to do, I'll grant that. But if this is a priority of ours, which it is, in order for us to move away from China faster.
So one of the challenges when you have an issue that is this complicated is, where in the Pentagon does somebody feel that they own it and have both the authority and the leadership to drive it? One of the tools you have that's coming along that's helpful is modern data analytics, because one of the challenges in the supply chain is just seeing it, being able to map it. In many areas, that would have been vastly harder to do with as complex a world as we have, but data analytics is letting people see into their supply chain better. That can go a long way. Many of the authorities, DPA Part 3 and so forth, that allows people to make these investments, they exist if everyone can agree on where the problem is and what needs to be done. So part of the mapping in those is to help make it clear, this is a particular choke point, this is a particular risk, and the ability to onshore to whatever it is will pay off, right? And then you can help move it. But I think hopefully that with advances in some of the data analytics, they can get further progress on that issue.
Thank you so much. And then to Mr. Paxton, you know, one of the first things I asked when I came, of our shipbuilders, when I came to Congress, and was hearing, Mr. DeLuzio, your head. I'm kidding. Not used to the second row and this angle. But one of the things I first asked our shipbuilders was, you know, if you're facing these cold supply chains, why can't you build commercial? And certainly something that I've seen throughout COVID with some of the most resilient businesses that I have in my district, they had some combination of military and commercial technology that they were selling. And so when we see these disruptions, when we know how bad it is to go cold, when we see that resilience, and then when I get a brief in this committee that our competitors are doing just that after being told by our shipbuilders that we somehow could not do that, and you know, I just want to understand what is the hang up there, because it seems like a good solution and it seems like our competitors are doing it.
I will say some of our shipyards are doing that. Now it's out of the scope of some Navy shipbuilding programs, but we certainly have shipyards that do that. If it's Coast Guard shipbuilding, they cut their teeth on commercial work. We do have some traditional Navy shipbuilders that would have had a gap about 8 months if they didn't have commercial work, but they had that commercial work in there, and that got them past 8 months. A shipyard will not be in business for 8 months if they have to maintain their employment and have no work. And so that has happened in a traditional Navy shipbuilding yard. The last thing I'll say is military spec is serious work, and that's work that a lot of our shipyards are focused on because that's what their customer demands.
Thank you. My time's expired. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Chair, I recognize the gentleman from Mississippi, General Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, witnesses, for being here. And I've missed a lot, so if I double tap, but Mr. Whitman stole all my good questions. But just I just want to double tap on how important the consistency of requirements is to our industrial base. Number one, to produce in bulk and to bring the cost down for the United States government, the manufacturer, and it does everything. I want to talk just a little bit about that in a different sense. Many of our services like to get a product, they tell you what they want, and then they want to start making changes because there's a new shiny object. I can't update my iPhone every time it changes, or I would never have an iPhone if I get the newest one. How much does that hurt you when they change the requirements, and how much does that cost the American taxpayers?
The lack of consistency is a real problem. I mean, I'd go back to the start of your question about even the requirement process itself. Increasingly, as new technology is developed outside of the Department of Defense, we don't always know what we want inside the Department of Defense. And so I think it's important to open up that requirements process a little bit, be open to companies, to industry on ideas that they have, and then to be consistent, but also allow mechanisms to modernize in a different way than we used to. Your phone is a perfect example of that. We used to think of modernizing as buying something for a generation, putting new things on it, but now modernization takes place while we sleep. So that lack of consistency makes it hard for industry to put its investments in place. Contracts are the most obvious way, obviously, but companies that wait for a contract are behind the curve, and they know that. They look at strategies, they look at statements, they have conversations. They want to line up their industrial investments in advance of the contract so they're ready. So that consistency is important, because without it, it increases the risk of making those investments.
So how do we stop the good idea fairies? And I'll use an example, the landing ship medium or the light amphibious warship, the Law. You know, it's not made to be a combat ship, okay? But now we want to say, well, it's not this or it's not this survivable. I mean, we try to add purposes to it to build it something that it was not intended to be. We did that with the Humvees in the Iraq War. We went from something that was to move around rear areas, light-skinned, to not be a combat vehicle, and tried to turn it into a combat vehicle, which it'll never be. So how do we stop these good idea guys in back rooms who go, hey, we can add this, we can add this? How do we stop that? Because that costs us tremendous dollars and readiness.
So one of the things is internal to the Pentagon and those decision processes to require the requirements changes and the dollar costs be dealt with at the same time, right? If you're going to change the requirement, you've got to at the same time explain the dollar cost and how that's going to be absorbed and what the offsets are. When you can have, as you gave examples of taking something for a completely different purpose, the place you can manage is when you say, in 2 to 3 years, there will be a block upgrade of this platform. And then everybody knows to buy parts to get to until that point. Everyone knows at that point there's going to be an upgrade of some piece of it. Those are much more manageable. Those the supply chain knows how many to make. It's, as you point out, when you're trying to take one thing and use it for another, you can often drive the challenge.
And just real quick, you know, I mean, the Navy owes us a ship plan, not a multiple choice of what you get to choose. They owe us what we're going to build the next 10, 20 years, and some type of cycle that you can rely on as being reliable. These are the things we're going to build so you can maintain those workforces, do them in bulk when possible, and bring them out on a schedule on time. The final question I want to ask is, what is industry doing? China is in all our business. They're in intellectual property. They're stealing intellectual property. They're embedding in all of our security things in the industry. What is industry doing to combat China and understanding that they're a threat to national security, even in the civilian shipbuilding or airplane building modes? What are we doing to kind of keep them out or to shield us from the threats of the Chinese government?
I'll take it from the beginning. I will say we are suffering as an industrial base from heavy subsidization in China. That's been a concerted effort for the last 20 years, and our supply chains are weaker from it. And certainly we don't build commercial assets for international commerce because we can't compete against the Chinese government.
And real quickly, on that same thing, are you identifying to DOD what supply chain issues, critical resources, critical assets that we're short of in order to maintain ship and airplanes and building them? Is that communicated to DOD so they understand what those restrictions are?
There are, yes, ongoing conversations with the Department of Defense among the the primes, the companies that work with the department about where they have concerns in their supply chain.
Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Escobar, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our ranking member, and thanks to our witnesses. Gentlemen, thank you for being here with us. Good afternoon. I represent the great community of El Paso, Texas, which is home to two tremendous assets. The first is, of course, Fort Bliss, which is the nation's second largest military installation and the largest joint mobilization force generation installation in the Army. The second key asset for us is the University of Texas at El Paso, which has a phenomenal engineering department and has been a national leader on additive manufacturing. And I have seen firsthand the benefit of tapping into the brilliance of our higher educational institutions in order to capitalize on the talent there and the innovation there, and to use it for our national defense, and indeed even for some very practical purposes. One of the things that has been going on at Fort Bliss in my district is the creation of 3D barracks that have been built using 3D printing capabilities. It's incredible. I've toured them, felt them, seen them, walked around in them. It really is amazing, especially as we think about our outdated facilities that have not seen enough investment. And so I'd like to ask actually all our witnesses, and maybe starting with you, Secretary Fanning, could you give us input on utilizing additive manufacturing capabilities to shore up the state of our installations and our shipyards?
I think there's still tremendous untapped potential in additive manufacturing. On the manufacturing side, it started with how can we manufacture a part differently, and now they're completely re-engineering things because they can make parts in ways that they never imagined before, which allows them to reimagine what it is they're building to begin with. And so certainly, I know from my time in the Department of the Army that we were thinking about that, how you could do that for installations even on a deployable basis. NASA's looking at it for Mars and the Moon, and so there definitely are applications for that for installations which absolutely are underinvested in. One of the many things underinvested in over years.
Thank you.
It is a fascinating technology with incredible capability. I mean, one of the most common problems we have in defense is we want small quantities of unusually shaped things as a spare part, and it's hard to convince somebody to put together a manufacturing line to do that. But with additive manufacturing, somebody can say, give me the digital design, I will print 1, 2, 3, whatever you want. So those changes are really driving consequences for housing, for parts, and for other things. I think there's a long way to go, and this is why university research is so valuable to help us understand what is possible, and then industry and the department can take advantage of that to really change the way things work.
Thank you for the question. I would also add that right now we're in the process of additive manufacturing, 3D printing, still needs to be certified. So we're still kind of in this stage as it relates to shipbuilding. If you put that part in there, it still has to meet military spec, and we still need to understand how that's going to work over the life of that vessel. So we're in the learning phase, we're in the let's get there phase, but some of that stuff still needs to be tested to make sure it can withstand military operations.
And really, to that point, I am very curious about what you all might think are some of the biggest obstacles to putting this potential on steroids, so to speak. How we can really capitalize on this in a more urgent way.
I think you hit the key one, which is if everything has to be certified, right? If each piece needs its own certification process, then you can't build one-offs. Now, if the piece of equipment can be certified for what it produces, I think you're there. But that requirement to say, I'm treating it like it's an assembly line, it's going to produce 1,000, I want to test a sample, doesn't work if you're producing 1, 2, or 3. And so I think that may be your largest obstacle. They may have others as well.
I would tie that back to the requirement process too. You might be defeated right from the start where something is baked into the requirement process. If you have the flexibility, the certification process is an issue. And I want to foot stomp on something David said. The quantities, the defense industrial base is huge, but the quantities of some things it needs don't necessarily yield some organic growth for chips, for critical minerals, or for the parts that you might be talking about in this instance. And so sometimes the limited quantities of things we buy make it hard to find a new source for them.
Thank you, gentlemen. My time has expired. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska, General Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to all three of you. It's great to be with Mr. Fanning. We serve on the Air Force Board together, and you do a great job, so appreciate that. The state of the defense industrial base is obviously weak. I think we get that from the briefing today. And we see it with Ukraine. Now we're seeing it with Taiwan. Hard to do both at the same time. And so this is a strategic issue with strategic consequences that we got to get right. So my first question for Mr. Paxton. The CNO recently highlighted the inability of the defense industry to keep up with the shipbuilding requirements. So for example, they want 3 Arleigh Burke destroyers. The industry can only do about 2. When it comes to attack submarines, we need 2 a year. We can only get 1. How do we get this right?
Well, I think from the get-go, we want to get the requirements right. We want to make sure we're, in a partnership together with the Navy, that we know exactly what we're going to go build it. I do think industry would disagree a little bit and say if we had that demand signal previously, we would be ramping up already. We can certainly meet 3 DDGs a year, and we can certainly do the work we're doing on submarines, but and also, industry wants to work with Navy on this. It should not be a adversarial type scenario. Industry is making investments in their facilities constantly in their workforce. So I think there's a disagreement that we're not meeting that mark.
Okay, so it sounds to me like right now we're not meeting it, but we have the potential that we can meet it.
Sure. Okay. I mean, and I think, again, we would probably disagree that we're not meeting it right now. I think there's things that are inherent in the shipbuilding and ship repair that cause certain schedule delays and some certain issues that aren't all industry's fault.
One of the things I read recently, and it's alarming, that China has 10 times the shipbuilding capacity that we have. I think as Americans, we need to think about that. I think that's unacceptable. Mr. Norquist, the Department of Defense spent $34 billion, or roughly 4% of their total budget, on innovation spending. And of those projects funded with this innovation spending, only 3% resulted in operational capability being delivered to the warfighter. So what recommendations would you have for changing our R&D process to increase the return on investment?
So one of the important things is to make sure that those who are funding research and development are connected with those who have responsibility to field systems and requirements. And so one of the challenges is making sure they're meeting. So the answer is, if somebody succeeds in this research initiative, are you going to pick it up? And what we have found in the past is in some cases that understanding wasn't there. In others, when it was, the question is, did you just say you're going to pick it up, or did you set aside money to be able to pick it up? And so one of the challenges becomes, how do you set aside both, how do you build that connection between those two communities? And the other is, how do you set aside, like we do for S&T, the money to pick up that result when it succeeds, to allow them to start? Now, you go to the service, so you got to finish funding it in the out years if you're going to pick it up. But that's, I found, was the most common breakdown. Either the research committee and they hadn't talked with the acquisition, or at the point of handoff, the person says, well, I don't have money in my budget this year, but maybe in 2 years I can, at which point the small business is going somewhere else. That would be my primary recommendation.
So is this like an organizational problem? We just don't have them linked correctly?
Part of it is. I mean, part of it is making sure that those groups, I mean, if you think about it, we do a pretty good job in the Department of Defense, or they do, when they have to have an airplane at a base with crew and a facility by a certain point in 3 years, right? Those things line up. So those communities are able to talk. The question is, what is it about when we research things that when they have breakthroughs, it isn't quickly picked up, and how do we make that go faster?
I did have a question for Mr. Fanning on rare earth elements, but I think you've already addressed that. I would say that we do have that capacity in our own country, so it just takes willpower and a plan to do that, and we can't rely on China. But I want to ask you a follow-up, because I think you addressed it very well already. So with that, I appreciate all three of you. I yield back.
Yeah, on that point, I would like for y'all to give it some thought and follow up with the committee and let us know if there's something we can do in the NDA that would facilitate or aid companies in that processing lane to be able to stand up more capability for that processing to take place either in CONUS or at least in our hemisphere where we have some friendly allies. It is completely unacceptable that we're so heavily reliant on China for those minerals as well as their processing. Chair, now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. DeLuzio, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thanks for being here today. I want to focus my question on the Defense Department's 2022 report, I should say, on how consolidation in the defense industrial base poses serious risks to our national security. Weak or frankly non-existent antitrust enforcement, in my view, allowed this to happen. And here's where we are. Through vertical and horizontal acquisitions since the 90s, we've gone from 51 to only 5 aerospace and defense prime contractors, a 90% reduction. Over that same period, we've seen suppliers in a bunch of categories disappear, depriving the American people of competition for key elements of our defense. Tactical missile suppliers, 13 down to 3. Fixed-wing aircraft suppliers, 8 down to 3. Satellite suppliers, 8 to 4. We've got 90% of our missile suppliers, 90% of our missiles coming from 3 sources now. This defense industry consolidation, this lack of competition, it's leaving us, I fear, ill-prepared and harming our national security and readiness. One reason I was eager to come to Congress and join this committee was to dig in on how consolidation in so many industries, including our military's industrial base, is hurting our country and in conflict with our economic goals to bring more union jobs, manufacturing, and supply chains back to this country. 2019 piece from the American Conservative, Matt Stoller and Lucas Kuntz, they wrote, despite spending large amounts of money on weapon systems, the American defense establishment often gets substandard equipment. It's dependent for key sources of supply on business arrangements with potentially hostile powers. The problem is so big, so toxic, and so difficult that few lawmakers even want to take it on. So today, gentlemen, my question to each of you is the same. What do you see as the gravest threat caused by this consolidation in the defense industry? Mr. Fanning, start with you, sir.
Thank you. An important question. I don't think consolidation is what's to blame for the shrinking number of companies doing business with the Department of Defense. And by the way, if you look at non-defense companies doing business with the Department of Defense, that's shrunk even more. I think consolidation is, first of all, at the prime level was by design in the 90s when the Pentagon realized that we weren't going to be buying as much. Part of competition is having competitions. And the Department of Defense determined we have too many companies for what we're going to be buying in the future and started the process of consolidation. And consolidation can be very important, a tool for growth for large companies. It can be an important tool for small companies to access capital, to access workforce, processes, expertise, or so forth to continue to develop what it is that they're growing. And it's an important part of every industry's evolution. I think the real thing to look at in the DIB is why is it so hard for new entrants to break in? Because I think it is increasing. The department's always been difficult to work with for obvious and important reasons, but I think over time it's becoming increasingly difficult. And as more technology is developed outside of the department versus the 1960s, it's ever more important that we find ways to let those new entrants in and grow the DIB with new entrants. That's a part of what goes hand in hand with consolidation.
Mr. Norquist.
Yes, I think when you start, most of those in that report, most of those mergers and acquisitions occurred several decades ago, driven in fact by the drawdown after the Cold War. What you've seen mostly in the more recent time is drop in firms willing to enter the defense industrial base, or firms who are already here leaving, not necessarily primes, but others. And I think that gets back to the question of one is, what's the if you're not buying as many helicopters, you won't have as many companies that make them, because when one person loses, they can't sit out of the business for 4 years very, very easily. But for the smaller firms, the ones you're trying to grow to come in, what are the barriers that we are putting in their way, and how do we try and remove those? Because part of the way the private sector grows competition is new firms keep entering and new disruptors keep showing up. And so one of the questions is, are we properly making it suitable for those firms to come in? There are certainly mergers and acquisitions where somebody's trying to protect the loss of a supplier who might otherwise leave the industrial base, or there's a technology they think they can make more effective. But I would focus on why are people not staying and how do we draw people in, because that's the best ways to sustain competition.
Thank you. Mr. Paxton?
Yeah, I would just say from the shipyard perspective, again, we're heavily capitalized, intensive organizations. We're dealing with facilities that have working waterfronts where oftentimes, even if you're not in Navy shipbuilding, if you want to get into some of the maritime supply space and shipyard space, you don't even have access to it from a geographical standpoint. So there's some of that limitations that exists in our kind of smallest piece of the pie.
Okay. Gentlemen, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Yeah. Mr. DeLuzio brings up a great point, and we're going to pay more attention to this. Not only are these companies getting gobbled up by the primes, we have got to figure out a way to help these small and mid-sized defense contractors be able to grow without being consumed, and so that we have a broader base, industrial base, and we're going to be having some dialogue about that as we move forward. But thank you for talking on that, and I share your concern about it. Chair, and I recognize as the General from Texas, Admiral Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I'll be brief. Most of my questions have been asked and answered today, so I appreciate y'all's time and your expertise. My only question today is, yesterday we had our first hearing, and it was focused solely on the threat that's posed by Chinese Communist Party. China's able to innovate and acquire weapon systems for their military at an alarming rate, much faster than we are, of course. Frequently, these Chinese weapon systems look very similar to our platforms or those of our allies, and we've been told, that a large part of that is, just they don't have the bureaucracy we have. Obviously, they can get right to the point, and they're gathering information from us. So, Mr. Norquist, can you talk to us about the effect of theft and espionage by our adversaries on our defense industrial base? What are the defense contractors doing, trying to defend against these activities, and how can we on this committee help in that effort?
So I think the challenge when you're dealing with a country like China that is not only able to compete industrially and build its own technologies, but it steals to stay close, right? Wherever you're headed, it's actively stealing. There's a number of things that are going on, and I'll say they're both between the department and the industrial base. One is alerting firms straight up to the risk of their IP of when they do business in China, when they're required to share things, and what vulnerability that creates so that they don't realize they're just handing something over. There's been work to try and protect innovative small businesses that are developing from having investment capital coming in from overseas, and we have some rules on it. The second one is protecting individual companies. We put a lot of emphasis in our association with our membership on cybersecurity, and the point is, yes, the department is developing CMMC cybersecurity standards. While they're still working through that, don't wait on the standard. Everybody needs to constantly be securing their network to protect yourself, and that's a major area of emphasis to be able to protect those organizations in that way.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I don't have any further questions. I yield back.
Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Hawaii, Ms. Dakuda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the written testimonies presented today, thank you for being here, by the way, all three of our witnesses did call attention to the harms imposed by continuing resolutions and budgetary uncertainty on our defense industrial base. Last month, our country reached our debt limit, and we are now heading towards a potential default sometime early this summer, unless Congress acts. We all know that a default would be devastating, but even the prospect of default over the next few months will generate a lot of uncertainty and anxiety for the industry. What are the impacts of continued uncertainty around the debt limit on our defense industrial base, especially small businesses and our workers? How urgent is it that Congress act to get the debt limit issue resolved?
I think none of us really knows what would happen if we don't resolve the debt ceiling issue, but for our industry and for our members, it adds another variable to the disruptive budgeting cycle. I mean, we are sort of used to not knowing what the top line will be, although there's been some consistency lately, or when we'll get it, when a budget will be passed, or how long we assume there's a continuing resolution. So the best case scenario is it's just a quarter rather than a year, or longer than a year. And this just adds another variable to that equation that makes it harder to imagine how we're going to get to the end game. And so it's more disruptive from a planning perspective for industry.
I agree on the comments on the debt ceiling and those types of uncertainties where people don't know what the consequences will be for other areas. But you highlight as well, rightfully, the challenge with continuing resolutions, and it comes up both in the form of hit the brakes, hit the accelerator. Service companies, and there's one that we were working with, they get stop work orders, and so they lay off all their staff, and then wait until the company is confident there'll be enough O&M to continue, and then they get told to hire them back. And so you have challenges recovering the workforce. You have times when the department did signal it wanted additional munitions, and then they couldn't do the ramp-up for the length of CR. So that sort of hit the brake, hit the accelerator is very disruptive, and this is just another example that folks have to deal with.
I concur with my colleagues. I would say on Navy maintenance and modernization, the planning that has to go in there is impacted greatly with CRs, with budget uncertainty. We see the starts and fits in that area.
Thank you. I want to kind of expand a little bit on that workforce issue. There's been discussion in exchange for addressing the debt limit. Some have floated perhaps deep spending cuts to balance the budget, looking perhaps at over the next 10 years, using fiscal 22 as a spending level, as a blueprint. Now, according to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, without tax increases, that could mean cutting 25% of government spending across defense and non-defense programs. And if we left defense and veteran spending off the table, that translates to 33% in non-defense programs, including Social Security and Medicare. To that end, how would significant cuts in non-defense programs in healthcare, education, we've been talking a lot about workforce and education today, affect our defense workforce, our ability to attract, develop, and retain the talent we're going to need to basically innovate and create critical technologies, fill these jobs? So to that end, any response?
Well, I think for our industry, we're aerospace and defense, there are enormously important investments that are in the non-defense side of the house too. But also, as you pointed out, building a workforce takes a very long time. Anybody can be like me and decide to be a history major in college, but if you want to study STEM in college, you have to have had a long track record of science and math to get there. And so many of these things are important in building the ecosystem in which we thrive. But I think one of the purposes of this hearing is that we've determined that we've underinvested in the defense industrial base to have it shaped and poised for what we need, both now with what's happening in Europe, but with any potential conflict that might happen around Taiwan.
So I think we all recognize deficits are real, they're significant, and there are consequences. But we've also seen what happens with sequestration on what it does to the Department of Defense, what it does to readiness, and particularly the cost of trying to come out afterwards, after we've seen, as was mentioned earlier, those readiness and O&M cuts go through. And at the end of the day, your national security should be tuned to your mission and your requirements. And when those requirements go down, the spending comes down, and when those requirements go up, they go up. Otherwise, you're creating unnecessary future costs to dig out of a hole you've just created. So, agree.
Thank you very much, and I think you'll all agree with me that our people really are an asset. We talk about supply chain. Our people, our workforce, are part of that critical defense industry base, so thank you for being here.
Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Jimenez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fanning, would you say that many, if not most, of the materials and critical minerals that we need exist in the United States?
Yes.
Well, I submit to you, Mr. Chairman, that the problem is us, that we're schizophrenic. We're here in the Armed Services Committee telling you, hey, we got to get those minerals, and yet there are other agencies within the federal government, like the EPA, that say, well, you can't get them because they're in some kind of land you can't touch, just like the Biden administration just took out, I think, tens of thousands of acres that we know those minerals are there, and they say you can't touch it. And so, Mr. Chairman, I think we need to determine, okay, whether our national security, takes precedence. And I'm not saying that you can't get those minerals without also protecting the environment. You can have both. I actually believe in the win-win scenario. Mr. Paxton, when's the last time that the shipbuilders in the United States built a cruise ship?
We have not built a cruise ship in quite some time, sir.
When's the last time you built a super tanker?
We've built a lot of tankers that have managed to work in domestic trades here in the United States, sir. We did that all through 2010, through 2012. When there was a demand signal that we needed to build tankers, we went out and built tankers.
Yeah, but I'm talking commercially,
Yes, sir. We have stepped away from U.S. flag, U.S. build, U.S. crude presence in international commerce, sir. And there's many reasons I could, flags of convenience, heavy foreign subsidization. There's a litany of things that have deterred commercial investment in those areas because it's not a level playing field.
And because you don't have commercial capacity, then it must hurt your ability to produce, our capital ships, our Navy ships, right?
Well, I think we do have a commercial industrial base that still exists. We have laws that say, hey, if you're going to move product between points in the United States, you're going to go on U.S. built, U.S. crewed, U.S. flagged ships, and that has benefited that ecosystem, that industrial base, and we still need that. I would contend we need to think, to your point, why aren't we in international commerce? We list the oil export ban with no commensurate requirement that any of those, national security energy cargoes, LNG or oil, go on U.S. built, U.S. flagged ships in international commerce. I would argue that would have been a good thing to do.
Fair enough. And Mr. Norquist, would you agree that the problem that we have with our industrial base, I'm new to this committee, so I'm just learning, but it appears to me that what we have is partly an issue of fleet management, and I'm talking air fleet, I'm talking about tanks and stuff on the ground. I'm also talking about the fleet, that we don't, you have an issue of inconsistency. If we were consistent in how we purchased stuff, and we always bought planes, and we always had ships, and we always had tanks, and we always had all this, and you knew that consistently that you could ramp up to meet that demand, is that something you would agree with, or?
Absolutely. You have both consistency and demand for production, but you mentioned earlier in maintenance, if there is a maintenance, and this is most common in ships, where the ship's supposed to be there on a certain date and it doesn't arrive, there is a consequence down the line for the readiness of your fleet and other maintenance. So it is both in the regular maintenance schedule for equipment and the consistency of what you're purchasing and in what quantities.
Right. Well, look, I used to be a fire chief, and I used to have fire trucks, and we'd have, for every online fire truck, every 2 online fire trucks, I actually had a spare, right? So that we'd always be in service, but there was always time for that fire truck, ambulance or whatever to be in service. But it appears to me that what we have now is really an inconsistency in budgeting. So you can't ramp up, and sometimes you ramp up, we tell you to not ramp down, and then that also leads to your inability to retain talent and workers, because nobody wants to go to someone that, well, I may have a job for two years versus I have a job, right?
That's right.
Okay, so I guess I answered my own question. The way to, I guess the way to combat this is to have consistency in budgeting, consistency in planning, and consistency in procuring the things that we need as a nation. And then finally, I do believe that China is, what they're doing is undercutting our industrial capacity, not only to increase their industrial capacity, but also to hurt us in time of conflict, to decrease our ability to produce those things we need if we, in fact, get into a conflict. So any comments on that from the three?
The only comment I'd make, sir, is we just experienced it. At the middle of the pandemic, you had about 100 container ships off of Long Beach. And guess what we ended up doing? Passing the Ocean Shipping Reform Act so we could stop, getting gouged by international shipping conglomerates, which were primarily Chinese, and they would come to our docks, drop off a TEU that they moved for $15,000, usually moves for $1,500, and wouldn't take any of our agricultural commodities back out. They would go with empty TEUs because it was more lucrative to take that back and keep our commodities here. So that's a problem.
Fair enough. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Carbajal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fanning, Mr. Norquist, and Mr. Paxton, thank you for joining us today. With the ongoing discussions regarding the debt ceiling and the focus to control government spending, what can be done within the Department of Defense or in collaboration with the Defense Industrial Base, to be more efficient and effective with the current allocation of funds, rather than continuing to increase the overall top line of the department's budget?
I don't want to beat a dead horse, but there is a lot of inefficiency in how we budget and how we respond and have learned to respond, both on the industry side and the Pentagon side, to continuing resolutions. That is an expensive way to operate year after year after year. That is absolutely one thing that could make the department and industry more efficient.
So I'll sort of highlight two things. One is, one place that you find reforms and opportunities for savings is as you analyze a process inside the department. Usually, this is something where the deputy secretary takes the lead or service secretary. They look at a process, they try and figure out how to automate it or accelerate it, and they generate savings. That has happened in previous administrations I've been part of. Kath Hicks just kicked off her effort with the Defense Management Institute as the current deputy secretary. She's doing a great job there as well as on data analytics, and so I think the ability of her to try and help drive internal reforms. The second is places where, for external reasons, we hit the brakes and then we hit the accelerator. And so you'll see this in acquisition. You'll see this with continuing resolutions where we tell everyone, don't spend in the first quarter because of CR, and then the department has to spend it all before the end. Those are other places where it's more self-inflicted because we're not even getting the value for the resources we're putting against it. Those are some of the places that I would look to try and drive efficiency and reform, in addition to the ones.
Paxton.
Yeah, I was just going to say acquisition strategies that work. You know, we see advanced procurement, incremental funding, block buys, where we can do that and we can see where the efficiencies are, buy that long lead time material. That'll drive affordability. And that's been proven in a lot of shipbuilding programs.
Thank you. Mr. Fanning, in your statement, you highlighted multiple areas that Congress and industry should work together on to increase the speed of delivering capabilities, one of which is fixing the budget process. We've heard the need for a stable funding process and the need for it to be more agile and responsive to new information and changing needs. What do you mean by a more agile process? What would that look like? Can we modify the current process, or do we need to start from scratch?
Well, there is a commission looking at the PPBE process. David and I are both on it. So whatever I answer now, I have to say as an individual and as part of the commission. But I think we need to find a way to get something to program of record and fielded faster. We need to figure out what we have to cut out of the process. We're talking about the size of the defense industrial base and the barriers to entry for new companies. This is a major barrier to entry. The length of time it takes for a company to develop something, bring it to the Pentagon, and get it as a program of record exceeds investment timelines of the private investments that they're bringing to bear on this. And so if we're going to keep pace or not lose more pace to China and also try to grow the industrial base by creating opportunities for new entrants, we've got to find a way to get the Pentagon process faster.
Thank you. Mr. Fanning, a repeated phrase in your statement was supply chain issues. The approach to supply chain management for the Department of Defense is typically left to the prime contractors to manage. When questioning the department on why programs are delayed, a common issue is subcontractor management and other supply chain issues. I believe the space segment of the defense industrial base is a great example of limited suppliers of components and resources. And while the number of suppliers has rapidly increased over the last few years, it's still a budding market, and companies are unable to meet the demand. This problem became very apparent during the pandemic as things were starting to get better. Russia invaded Ukraine, causing another impact to the supply chain. This invasion has limited the supply to gases that are commonly used as propellants for electric thrusters and are also used in the manufacturing of semiconductors. Are there ways to have more transparency in our subcontractors and their suppliers so we, the DoD, can have greater insights into the critical resources required for all the ongoing development acquisitions and programs in sustainment?
There are, and government and industry have been working together on this for a long time to better understand and have more transparency of the industrial base. To your point, it's not as big and robust as it might be if investments were different, if we thought about surge capacity different, if we thought about the capacity of the industrial base as a capability in and of itself. But it really was battered, both on our commercial and our defense side and our industry, by COVID and now by inflation.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair, now recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Strong, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members. In Defense News' listing of top 100 defense contractors worldwide, more than 25% have a presence in Alabama's 5th Congressional District. My district is also home to many smaller but equally innovative firms that do critical work to support our men and women in uniform. As you know, inflation as high as 9% in June of 2022 has had a significant impact on the cost of doing business. The FY23 NDAA included clear authority for the department to adjust contracts to account for inflation. Mr. Norquist, what are you hearing from your member companies regarding the impact of inflation?
So we're hearing a number of things, and it affects different companies differently. So certain contracts have adjustment clauses in, less of an impact. Firm fixed price, tremendous disruption. Small business locked into a multi-year contract that doesn't adjust for inflation, that was awarded right before the 9%, all of a sudden they're in a hole. So we're seeing significant challenges in those companies, because part of what people forget is it's a multi-year defense budget. So if somebody was awarded a contract prior to the spike in inflation, fixing 23 helps 23, but it doesn't solve that. And if you're a program manager, you may have been enacted funds, but if you didn't have it under contract, you're seeing bids come in that reflect inflation, but your budget doesn't. So it hurts both the government and industry.
Thank you. North Alabama is a haven for small and mid-sized businesses. Many of the small to medium-sized businesses in my district are moving toward becoming 100% employee-owned. While ESOPs are successful innovators in these areas, they are unequivocally susceptible to the valley of death in which promises non-traditional companies and startups become so successful under small business set-asides that they become acquired by large defense firms. Or they deliberately curtail their own success to retain the ability to win contracts as a small business. The FY22 National Defense Authorization Act included a provision which developed a pilot program to support the use of non-competitive procedures for follow-on contracts to businesses 100% owned by employee stock ownership plans, also known as ESOP. Do you believe that making these pilot programs permanent or potentially expanding the definition of nonprofit to contain 100% ESOP S-corps would benefit the defense industrial base?
So I'm familiar with the provision. I don't actually have data on how successful those firms have felt they have been in using it, but you certainly highlight the big risk, which is when a small crosses that line, if they don't cross it rapidly and have follow-on work, we tend to lose a large number of those small businesses the moment they become medium. So I do not know if how that provision has tracked, but I understand the provision, but you do highlight that line as a big challenge for firms.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, good afternoon. Appreciate you being here. I kind of want to hit on an area dealing with the industrial base and our deterrence strategy for Taiwan, if that's all right. Obviously, taking into account the lessons that we're learning from Kiev, and especially looking at the ample supply of artillery, especially rockets and missiles. Obviously, in the battle for Kiev, in the Ukraine war, artillery was one of the key things that obviously allowed the Ukrainians to push Russia back. It also demonstrates that we're going to need reliable replenishment capabilities to deter and defend against any amphibious assault towards the island of Taiwan. Now, that includes several tabletop exercises for what this is worth. In those exercises, the United States depleted critical long-range precision-guided munitions in less than 1 week in a Taiwan Strait conflict. So it seems that based on what we're seeing in Ukraine, if the U.S. were to be involved in simultaneous major theater wars, what do you think would be the most urgent hurdles to address and provide the capabilities, such as artillery, when called upon? Go ahead, Mr. Norquist, please.
So I think, first of all, there's a number of studies, and the CSIS did a particularly good one on this very issue. And so when you look at, and different theaters are different, right? When you look at the Pacific, you're looking at extraordinarily long ranges between platforms. And so long-range missiles would easily be high consumption rates. Munitions, those types of items in a high-end conflict do get consumed at much higher rates. So those are the ones that you need to focus on, as well as how to get them into theater, right? That's the other challenge. It's a long way to Taiwan, and trying to resupply during a conflict is a very complicated process.
And then I'm gonna follow up, especially on something like that, looking at the island nature being how it would be subject to blockades as well. How would that affect your analysis?
Well, it puts a premium on whether it's there in advance, right? Foreign military sales to Taiwan, where they have it pre-positioned, is dramatically better over trying to move it during a moment of intense conflict and making sure they're investing in the right types of defenses. As somebody has often described, if Taiwan makes itself more like a porcupine, this is a very difficult thing to do an amphibious invasion against.
Yeah.
But they've got to be able to put those investments in there.
As you know well, our NDA in 2023 established multi-year contracts for some munitions that have been pretty critical for Ukraine and maybe useful in our fight over Taiwan, if it comes to that. Do you believe that the multi-year contracts would help bolster stockpiles by creating the demand signal for defense companies to produce goods that could be used in a protracted war while also potentially expediting the production and transfer of certain munitions?
So absolutely, the multi-year contract is a very valuable signal because it's more than a signal, it's actually a contract, right? It tells them, build this because we have a need. And then there are things one can do to move beyond that. There's some authorities this committee included that helps accelerate through some of the administrative side. You always have for long lead items the tool of advanced procurement, which we use with airplanes and others on a regular basis. So there's a number of tools to make it go faster, but multi-years are absolutely a valuable step in this direction.
Outstanding.
I would go back to consistency on this too. I mean, having seen this, all of us have years over years over years. Munitions are often a bill payer in the end game when you're putting the budget together because of the granularity of being able to say, well, we'll take 20% risk on that. So if you want that industrial base capacity and capability, there has to be consistent, determined investment in it over time. And we're talking about surge capability. You're now talking about stockpiling and then pre-positioning too, which is a whole different thing when it comes to Taiwan. But to have that capability to surge requires a consistent long-term investment. But one thing on block buys or multi-year contracts is it's running up against inflation, we're finding, in two different ways. One, suppliers are not wanting to bid 5 years out because they just don't know what inflation is going to do. If we get them to, if the big companies get the suppliers to do that and we take the contract to the Pentagon, the contract officials get anxious about a contract that has so much escalation in it over 5 years. And so we still have a lot to figure out on how to deal with inflation, especially over some of these long investments.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Waltz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll open this up to anyone who wants to answer on the panel. CSIS recently ran a war game that showed us falling significantly short in the Indo-Pacific theater on a Taiwan Strait scenario. I know you're not currently still sitting in your former positions, but to your knowledge, do we have enough forward in terms of stockpiles and munitions to sufficiently win? We'll set aside the debate of what victory actually looks like, but to sufficiently deter and then win should we have a conflict in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, I'm not current on what we have pre-positioned, but I think what we're seeing in Ukraine makes the answer pretty clear that we don't. And a part of that is because we are postured in so many different ways for peace, how we budget, the processes, the capability and capacity that we maintain, and then of course what we stockpile. So I think the answer is pretty clear from what we saw.
How do we efficiently incentivize industry? Right. On the one hand, we don't want to create a bunch of things we never use. On the other hand, we have to balance modernization with investing into legacy systems. Like, do you have any recommendations, and I'll take them for the record, on how this committee can be helpful there with industry?
There are a number of ways you can send signals, strategies, budgets. Industry looks at all of those and looks for some consistency into the future, so that the fit-up certainly helps with that. But ultimately, to really guarantee it, because again, industry will want to get out front of a contract, but it's the contract that really cements it into place for the long term.
I would only add that the department needs to understand in its wargaming and modeling the same type of results that CSIS saw in their study, and then change the requirements, right? You do that, and then you start putting it in your budget and your plans, and now you are receiving from the department the demand signal that the department is showing of, we intend to buy these in quantities over time.
Was CSIS too dire? Were they too, did they take too many negative assumptions into their war game? I mean, from the...
I would not assume so. Now, again, I don't know the department's analysis, and if I did, I'd probably be stuck behind a classification challenge. But when you look at high-end fights, we traditionally find they vastly consume more munitions than one would think they would. Just the intensity of the battle are very different than counterterrorism type of operations and the sheer volume. And we cannot assume the sort of, well, we'll do like World War II, and once it starts, we'll ramp everything up and we'll catch up over 3 years. We have to be able to position and prepare more carefully than that, given the nature of our modern industry.
I'd be interested in your thoughts, for the record, on how to actually help the Pentagon do that. In that same vein, do we have the stockpiles of parts for many of these high-end systems? For example, Joint Strike Fighter to conduct combat repairs. We have those PLL lines forward.
Do you know the answer?
In any type of cache environment?
I don't know the status of the forward line on the repairs for those. I wouldn't be able to weigh in at this point.
Okay, thank you. And finally, from a shipbuilding perspective, I mean, just to set the table, China has 50 shipyards that could fit a Nimitz-class carrier. We arguably have 2 to 4 that are incredibly old. The largest shipyard in China could fit all of ours in combined. I think there are roughly 50,000 commercial vessels compared to our 5, many of which they can nationalize and militarize. I don't believe there was any money in the bipartisan infrastructure deal, the once-in-a-lifetime deal that the president was pounding the lectern about just last night for shipbuilding, to my knowledge. Mr. Paxton, do you have a comment there?
Yeah, certainly there was not a comment on that. There is a PSYOP that's investing in our...
Is it sufficient, $20 billion over 20 years, when when we have an intel community that's blinking red over the next 5?
I certainly think our public shipyards need help. I don't represent them. They're not part of our group. To your previous question, though, this committee did authorize recapitalization of the National Defense Reserve Fleet, which, to your point about Taiwan, we do need logistics. We do need auxiliary vessels to sustain the fight, and we really don't have that right now in our...
Could we use Jones Act fleet, hardening, militarizing, perhaps upgrading a portion of that to then almost like a Civil Reserve Air Fleet? Is that, you think that's a viable concept? I'm out of time, but if you could answer for the record, that would be great.
Well, yeah.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Vasquez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the letters in my state got transposed, and it's New Mexico, but not a problem. Just a little bit different, but thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing examining the defense industrial base is incredibly important to New Mexico and to my district. New Mexico, as you know, is at the forefront of national defense, including research, development, and testing of some of the most critical technologies and programs that keep the United States safe. The defense industrial base is also an incredibly important economic engine and potential for economic development in the rural areas of my district. A study by the University of New Mexico showed that the state's military bases alone in New Mexico generate $3 billion in wages and supported more than 52,000 jobs. But there is opportunity to do more, not just for our national security, but for the benefit of our local economy. Now, Sandia and Los Alamos National Laboratories research and develop some of the most advanced technology in the world, technology that is often transferred to the private sector to be commercialized, where it supports thousands of jobs and generates millions of dollars in revenue, not just for my state, but for this country. At White Sands Missile Range, we are undertaking essential work to modernize our military, including testing hypersonic and long-range systems. If we can invent it in New Mexico and test it in New Mexico, we can build it in New Mexico. That's my theory. Co-locating elements for our defense industrial base in a state like New Mexico's that is so rich in the research and testing assets can have the benefits that we need in this state and across our economy, from those good-paying jobs in manufacturing to stronger educational pathways and training programs to help fill our workforce gaps. Mr. Fanning, in your opinion, how can we leverage the resources of a state like New Mexico to grow the defense industrial base, where we have opportunity, where we have willing participants to enter the workforce, and the key elements such as the national labs and testing ranges?
Well, I think we see all over the country where there are pockets where investment has grown up in aerospace and defense for obvious reasons. I think there are probably two key aspects to this. One is workforce. Companies will go where the workforce is, and so state and local investment in education, in apprenticeship programs, in STEM education makes a big difference, because that's really the critical element for our industry right now. And then the other is just what other economic investments that the local or state governments are willing to make. But I think making sure that you have that educational STEM pipeline is one of the most critical things to make sure that you have the capacity to keep growing in a regional area.
And Mr. Fanning, how can the private industry and part of the private part of the industrial base help support investments in education to help spur this workforce in places like New Mexico? What is the role, do you think, there for private industry?
There's a lot that private industry does to try and make up that gap. But we have a large aerospace company in Kansas that recruits off of farms, because they at least are thinking they're finding people that know how to work with heavy machinery. They're in the schools, they're doing their own apprenticeship programs. They're leaning far into this because of the problems that workforce has. When they find a willing partner at the state and local level, it just makes it that much more interesting. And you can see places around the country, Alabama, Colorado, where you have these pockets where all the different stakeholders come together, and they've had some success at growing organic capability.
Thank you, Mr. Fanning. And I just want to put a plug in for New Mexico State University. We used to have an aerospace engineering degree. Financially couldn't sustain it. Now, this was before we had the first purpose-built spaceport, commercial spaceport in the country, in Spaceport America, north of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. But that potential pool of talent that we have there, with the resources that we have in the federal government that also help support a host of engineering jobs, is a place that I think industry should continue to look to help create this pipeline of STEM jobs.
But you mentioned the interesting combination of a test range, universities, you talk about things like hypersonics. There's a series of emerging technologies in these areas that are going to have unusual sort of challenges to solve. So, for example, in our association, we've set up an Emerging Technology Institute that's working with universities to be able to do those types of things, and the emphasis on, do you have enough test ranges so when these new technologies like hypersonics come online, you can take advantage. So I really appreciate your leadership in this area, but this is something we from an association side recognize as a key need going forward, is to bring those players together.
Thank you, Mr. Norquist. And for my last question, what role does immigration have to play in helping to fill some of the gaps that we currently have in the STEM workforce at places like Sandia and Los Alamos in New Mexico?
So when you get legal immigration with STEM skill cells, I mean, this is the cheat code the United States has over the rest of the world, is our ability to attract people from everywhere else. And bringing them into the country is a huge help. It builds the workforce pool, and even if they don't go into the government because it's classified, the fact they're in the pool helps produce it and benefit everybody.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Fallon.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. As Mr. Norquist, as the representative of Red River Army Depot, the Center of Excellence for Tactical Wheeled Vehicles, I'm particularly sensitive to the needs of the Defense Industrial Base and the Department's Organic Industrial Base. While the commercial industrial base builds the systems we all know that we use, the depots, arsenals, shipyards are responsible for maintaining these systems and ensuring that they're ready for any future conflict. If it doesn't do a lot of good to have a shiny new Corvette in driveway if you can't maintain it, because it's going to be a flash in the pan. You have fun for a few weeks there, then you're going to have a little trouble. Over the last several decades, we've seen time and again when the life of a particular system is extended well beyond its original intent, it's always a benefit to the taxpayer and to our national security. This can be necessary based on the types of conflicts that we're in moving forward, because of the delays in new programs. The Army is currently undertaking a 15-year OIB modernization implementation plan for our depots to improve capabilities and leverage with new technology while saving the taxpayers millions. Sir, based on your experiences in both the private sector and in the DoD, what do you see as the values of depots, and what capabilities do they provide the DIB to meet and maintain our military's readiness requirements?
So you've highlighted, there's a couple of key ones. The first is, on the regular equipment, having it up and ready so that it's available for the warfighter when they need it, right? That's the key thing. If you don't have maintenance and we've seen the damage when the Russians tried to go into Ukraine with equipment that clearly was not well maintained. The devastation of poorly maintained equipment on a warplane is catastrophic. So the first and foremost is have the current capability ready. But as you point out, they produce a second option, which is if it's your advantage to extend the life of a platform because its capability and design makes it possible, you're looking to those depots to make that possible, to be able to redesign or re-engineer it, to swap out the parts that don't have that life extension with ones that do. And they give you a whole new set of choices which are valuable to the government and their decision maker. So both the readiness of the current force and the options of how to equip the future force are two of the core functions that the depots provide.
And sir, if I could do two follow-ups. What do depots provide that the private sector can't? And in your opinion, how could we better utilize these depots, which are really critical, to alleviate some of the strain on the DIB that we've been talking about all hearing?
Well, I think each of the public and the private sector each play a role to be able to address certain types of challenges, and it depends on the nature of the requirement, which one they use. And there are many firms that work with private depots in order to help them perform their mission, so that the combination of government and industry is apparent wherever you go. And so I think the question is, when the government decides its requirement, is which are the issues it's trying to solve and which is the best setup in order to achieve those.
Oh, thank you. And I think my colleague was mentioning about what impact does immigration have in STEM. I liked your answer, and I think I want to emphasize that you said legal migration is a benefit to the country. And I don't know any members on my side of the aisle that don't agree with that statement, that legal migration is a benefit to the country, a net benefit moving forward. So thank you very much, Mr. Norquist and the witnesses. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair, I recognize the gentlelady from Virginia, Ms. Kiggins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This question is for Mr. Paxton. I represent Virginia's 2nd Congressional District, so it's home to the Atlantic Fleet and to a lot of our shipbuilders and ship repair industry. And just meeting with the ship repair industry, we have BAE, NASSCO, Kiwanis, MHI, a lot of the big guys, and talking to them about retention of their workforce. And you all mentioned just workforce challenges, and they said the biggest problem for them is just the lack of predictability for acquisition and repair cycle. Because it's inconsistent funding for them. So they are frequently having to spend millions of their own dollars in keeping their staff, when really this should be funding that the government provides, or at least let's get on a more predictable schedule. So what can we do, or what can this committee specifically do to improve that process for them?
Yeah, I think it starts with having that maintenance and modernization plan where we know what's in that fit up, what's going to happen over the next 5 years, so the industry can plan for it. Because certainly industries in your district have invested heavily in their facilities and workforce, but they've also, maintenance and modernization goes through a lot of ups and downs, issuing WARN acts, and then they're letting folks go. And one little fact about the shipyard industry is when we try to get somebody in our trades, they go through their apprenticeship programs, they do all that great stuff, and they get certified, and they're a welder, or they're a machinist or electrician. That's enormous. And I think Mr. Fanning said it earlier, that once you go through that apprenticeship program, you have kind of a sense of belonging. When we have to let these workforce go because work flows don't come into the home port like they were predicted, that tradesman was going to be a project manager, but it takes about 5 to 8 years for that to happen, or a supervisor. And a lot of the guys in our shipyards are generational. They've had a mother or a father that's worked there, and they've won a career. And we have careers. You can start in the trades, and you can move into management, and you can move up. So when we have instability in the work forecasts going into the home ports, the real disruption is with that workforce and then with the supply chains. And so I'm not sure I'm answering your question precisely, but our workforce is incredibly important down there. The work that the Virginia Ship Repair Association does is amazing, and they're a strong supporter of what we do.
Yes. And we're happy to have them. And along those same lines with workforce challenges, and this isn't really a question, more of a comment, but just incentivizing our veteran population. Those guys understand the work ethic, they understand the work culture, they lived on those ships, they want to take care of those ships. So I know we've done a lot of work on the state level, especially in Virginia, about trying to transition those guys from active duty into how can they serve in repair and shipbuilding. But I definitely think we need to put more of a focus on that group. But my next question is about the smaller shipbuilding companies, because we've got the big boys, but we also have a whole lot of smaller ship repair companies, and these guys they play a pivotal role in just providing maintenance and that surge capability that we talked about. That's so important. So the complaints from those guys is that they are being neglected, and the bigger boys are getting a lot of the business, the majority of the business. So I want to look out for the small guys too, because I need them when we need them the most. So what can we do to ensure that the small guys are taken care of as well?
Sure. I think there is requirements that have been issued where we do have small business set-asides where work is pushed that way. I know a lot of our smaller shipyards do a ton of vendor work with our primes, so there's great relationships there, and they all work together. I think also there's unique circumstances where the smaller shipyards have fixed firm contracts, so when inflation and all these things have come in and material costs have changed, they're getting they have to absorb those costs a little bit different than the prime. So we got to look at that as well and see how we can help those shipyards weather a very different environment than we were living pre-pandemic.
Thank you. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Davis, for 5 minutes.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to each and every one of you. I had a quick question for Mr. Norquist in particular. I represent Eastern North Carolina's 1st Congressional District, which we have enormous challenges. But my question is, how can we encourage in particular in economically distressed areas, small and mid-sized businesses in particular, to compete to provide us with the best and strongest national defense possible?
So there's a couple of ways. I mean, certainly there are certain government programs designed to promote them, but I think one needs to go beyond that. And so one of the things, for example, our association does is to try and have events where people can come together. So organizations who have a company in your district who don't necessarily have those connections can come to events, meet people from the other companies, explain to them what their product does, what their company does, in order to build those. We have but the majority of our membership are small businesses, and it's the ability to meet with the government buyers and to meet with other vendors that is why they attend and bring them together. So I think those are the sort of things we do precisely for the benefit of those types of organizations and companies.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And Mr. Fanning, hearing back home about the logistical challenges faced specifically by the Fleet Readiness Center, East Cherry Point, North Carolina. They face enormous difficulties recruiting a stable workforce and acquiring resources to guarantee timely repairs for our military aircraft. From where you sit, how can Congress, how can I, representing this area, work in partnership with DoD to maintain a stable base of support for facilities like this, like the Fleet Readiness Center in my region?
Well, I think first of all, consistent budgeting. Companies or organizations that aren't working don't get paid for it, which is the first quarter of a fiscal year typically, and then they're asked to surge to make up in 3/4 of a year or half of a year what they weren't doing in the previous part of the year. That's more expensive because you're paying overtime and doing your labor. So anything that can be consistent in the budgeting process that allows any institution, government or industry, to plan and have consistency for its workforce is sort of a fundamental aspect, I think, a critical part of being able to maintain a steady workforce and provide some assurances to that workforce.
Okay. Thanks so much. Yield back.
Chair, now recognize the gentleman from Guam, Mr. Moylan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Paxton, with Guam and other outlying regions of the United States being geographically removed from much of America's industry core, what capabilities exist or would you recommend to service our military hardware with this huge buildup, especially in the Indo-Pacific area because of our threat? And recommendations specifically for our Navy vessels in Guam and other outlying areas of the United States.
Well, certainly we care a great deal about the maintenance and modernization of our vessels in the Western Pacific. So be that Hawaii and Guam. We want to see work done there and be stable. Beyond that, not trying to avoid the question, but I'm just trying to think more so our assets in Guam, and I just don't have a ton of visibility on that. I don't know if I can defer to my other two colleagues.
Well, I think, first of all, you have to recognize that given the pivot to the Pacific and given the challenge, Guam moves from being on the periphery to being in the dead center of the conversation, right? When we talk about distances of supplies to the Pacific, you're talking about distances from the continent. The distances from Guam are very different, and so being able to store things, being able to maintain things, all of those functions, when they can be safely done forward, tremendously change the calculus. So I think there's a different answer with the two new strategies we've seen about how central a role Guam is to the mission and to its ability to sustain the mission. So I think this is a great conversation out of the department about what can we do here so that, if you think about it, if the department has to move it all the way across during a conflict, they're putting people at risk that entire journey. If it's already there, then you save the bring it home, fix it, bring it back. So the question is, what are the assets that are best supported there? Those I don't know from a military mission point of view, but clearly its location dramatically changes its value in the situation.
I'd say the same thing. We talked about the volume of munitions you use is always more than you plan. The duration of an engagement is more than you plan as well. And being able to sustain equipment, ships in this case, closer to the fight means that they're available more and for longer periods of time. So I agree with David that Guam becomes much more interesting as we, geographically, as we think about planning and pivoting our budgeting and our programming and what have you towards something that's in that region.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time.
Yeah, that is a really critical area for us to focus some attention. Guam is going to be in the center of everything as we move into the Indo-PACOM theater, and we need to be thinking about these things now and making sure we're prepared before conflict rather than regretting that we didn't. You know, when we went into Afghanistan 20 years ago in Iraq, we really realized how unprepared we were as a nation. And I remember that's when I first got here. And our first 2 years, we were resolved to never let that happen again. Well, you know, we need to be thinking about, and I would like for y'all to be thinking about how we can bring our partners into that process to make sure Guam is fully prepared for whatever may come in the not-too-distant future. With that, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mills, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today to testify. Thank you, Mr. Fanning, for your service. As a Bronze Star recipient, military combat veteran, and also a former owner of 3 different defense businesses, I own one of 3 companies in the United States who had a unit capacity monthly of 150 to 200,000 A5 warhead pressed M430A1s, 433s. I can tell you, and I hope that you would agree, and please, if you don't, let me know, that energetics in our supply chain and consistency has been a real stronghold against the U.S. business stream. You know, I'm a big fighter for the idea of not just getting our military industrial base stronger, but also to ensuring consistency. We joke in the industry that the only consistency we have is inconsistency, and I think that remains true. But I think that also there's other factors. The DDTC sometimes has been politicized in many ways, which prevent our DSP-5s and DSP-83 approvals. The ATFEs, overregulation, sometimes with our Form 2, Form 9s being held for a prolonged period of time. Raw material costs due to inflation and the fact that we don't control enough of our actual at-home production. And that's something I really want to work with you guys in the industry as well as for within our committee, is to make sure that we bring more here at home when it comes to our ability to build, supply, and conduct our own LATs, LAPs. But I would also note that workforce shortages, is while it's a big factor, we also acknowledge the fact that in many cases, industries like ours doesn't exactly have the most desirable locations to live in, whether it's Texarkana, which some might find less appealing, Perry, Florida, or many of the others. And so I do understand that importance when we're trying to get STEM qualified individuals. But I've also noticed, and it wasn't noted in any of your testimonies, the issues within the banking industry's appetites. I have seen multiple times where small, medium businesses in the defense industry can't actually get the necessary advance payment or performance bonds because there are a lack of banks with an appetite to support the defense industries. And I wanted to just ask really quickly, do you find, in addition to the overregulation, that the banking industry's appetite to support the defense industry is also hindering us?
I'll start. We were seeing that in Europe before the invasion of Ukraine, and then watching very closely here in the United States a number of movements, but that was one of them. The defense industry in Europe was really struggling increasingly to find financing for that exact reason. We weren't seeing it here as much, and I would say the tide has changed dramatically in Europe in the last year, and so I think that will help over here with the industry to include small businesses, but we weren't seeing it leap over the Atlantic to the degree that it was happening in Europe, and we were watching it pretty closely.
And if I just may really quickly, where I'm seeing the biggest thing, I think, with the banking appetite isn't necessarily in the larger businesses. I find it in the smaller and the medium-sized businesses that haven't gotten that established revenue where the bank will overlook the risk simply based on the billions of dollars that are coming in defense. And so I think that it's somewhat going on, but perhaps at a lower level that your industry or your association isn't necessarily representing.
I think that speaks to the inconsistency we've been talking about.
Correct.
Particularly for small businesses in the defense industrial base. And now you have inflation on top of that, because as we've discussed, the supply chain it's not walled off for the industrial base, it's shared. And in inflationary times, there's all sorts of incentives to move to the commercial side. We have companies that are not getting deliveries from their suppliers who are willing to pay the penalty on the defense side because due to inflation, they can get more, even with the penalty, by delivering either all or some of what they're due to the defense companies to a commercial client.
And I just want to get through a couple of these questions. You know, one of the things I look at that is really important as a congressional representative is to be a good steward of taxpayers' money. Now, I'm all for ensuring readiness and making sure that we're more than equipped to handle the upcoming threats that we face. But I also understand that under the federal acquisition regulations, when we look at free and fair and open competition, we have things that have troubled me for years, which is things like BAFO. When we talk about the best and final offer, we'll look at 3 or 4 companies. And perhaps one company, because they have a better supply chain reliancy, because they do a lot more in-house, things like this, they fall outside of this 20% competitive range. And therefore, they're automatically disqualified, even though they're a cheaper and the same quality as the others that are there. Do you think there needs to be a bit of a change to the procurement regulations as well on how we do that?
So I think in some cases there may be a change. In some cases, it's the application, right? In many cases, there's the flexibility to properly account for the various strengths that different bidders can bring to the table. And does the acquisition community make a point of valuing those? And we mentioned earlier, the resilience factor is going to be of greater importance, and the acquisition community needs to look for that in its bidders to be able to say, I recognize this bidder brings greater resilience to this project than the others, and so that would matter.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. McCormick, for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. I'm sure you're excited to have my questions since I am at the tail end of this discussion. Thank you. This has been enlightening. In regards to what the chair just recently brought up, and in quoting this book, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with, it's basically the 2023 Center for Strategic International Studies War Game, The First Battle of the Next War. They identify, and I quote, military planning appears to assume that U.S. forces will be able to deploy onto sovereign territory of other countries during a crisis. In particular, the Army and Marine Corps seem to assume that the MLRs and the MDTFs will be pre-positioned in the Philippines, Taiwan, or on 4 Japanese islands before the conflict begins. However, such permissions for forward deployments en masse do not seem likely due to immense destruction the conflict would cause. They aptly noted that there is therefore the potential for a fundamental disconnect between U.S. war plans and political realities. I would make the case that we're doing the same thing as we plan and we prepare our forces, including my beloved Marine Corps, as we plan for pre-positioning people on islands in chains we don't really would have access to if a war actually began. And are we preparing for the right battles? In other words, we have to have we've never predicted a war yet correctly. We always end up in these conflicts we didn't anticipate. And if we put all of our development in our defense into baskets where we think it's a massive war, but we end up fighting all these other peripheral wars. Are we indeed, in your opinion, preparing for the variety of wars we could face in the future, or are we just really focusing too much on one theater?
It's hard, obviously, to gather a fulsome set of lessons from unclassified war games, although this was a pretty comprehensive set of games. But I think if we look at what's happened the last year in Ukraine, we should all be questioning all of our assumptions about planning, but particularly if we're looking at a Taiwan scenario.
I think when you look at a conflict, if you assume a solution or a problem, you have clearly misunderstood and not done enough history, right? What you look for is what are options, and do I have the capacity to take advantage of them if they present themselves? And what are the risks? There are certain things you can't assume you will have, and then if I don't, well, then I can't fight, because you may discover that's exactly what you can't have. So one of the challenges in going through this in wargaming is, what are the things that I should assume I might not have? And do I have an ability to work around that? And what are the things that if the window presented themselves, I could take advantage of? But as you point out, if you make too narrow a set of assumptions and everything breaks your way, you're not prepared for when they don't. And typically, they don't.
The only thing I'd add is from the standpoint of logistics and sea lift, we need to get onto the business of, service life extensions, buying some foreign aspects of our ready reserve fleet, and then building purpose-built ships that are going to be able to sustain and provide the logistics that we need.
Fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward to learning tons more on how we can streamline the process for both what we're facing now and into the future. With that, I yield, sir.
I thank the gentleman from Georgia. I think our witnesses have been very helpful. I appreciate your preparation and your time today. And with that, we are adjourned.